Hi guys. Tonight we're heading back to a time when the world was colder, darker, and far less forgiving than the one you know. Imagine a stone castle rising out of a frozen valley, its towers catching the last orange glimmer of a dying Sunday. The air bites at your face, the ground crunches under your boots, and even the river has stopped breathing beneath a sheet of ice. You can almost hear the wind scraping across the battlements like a restless ghost. Life inside those walls wasn't just about fighting battles or hosting feasts. It was about surviving winters that could last months. And to be honest, if you were dropped into that world tonight, you probably wouldn't survive this. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights and picture yourself stepping through the gates. The first thing you feel is the cold. It's not like modern cold, the kind that gives you goosebumps and sends you reaching for a thermostat. It's the kind that seeps straight into your bones, the kind that turns your breath into fog and your fingers into brittle sticks. The castle around you seems to hum with silence, as if even the walls are holding their breath against the chill. You walk deeper into the courtyard, boots skidding slightly over packed snow. A few torches flicker along the walls, their light more orange than bright, revealing patches of frost on the stone. Somewhere far above, a shutter bangs in the wind. The smell of smoke teases you from the great hall, that single building within the castle that promises relief. Step inside, and your eyes sting from the sudden warmth and smoke. A massive hearth dominates the room, flames licking upward, sparks swirling like golden insects. Men and women gather close, wrapped in wool and fur, cups of ale steaming in their hands. The heat doesn't travel far, it never does, but compared to the courtyard, this feels like paradise. That fire is not just comfort, it is life itself. Without it, the castle would be a tomb. You notice how everyone arranges themselves by rank and need. Nobles closest to the blaze, servants further back, guards standing near the drafty doors. The hearth becomes a symbol of order, of hierarchy, even of civilization. Historians often say that the hearth was the real heart of medieval life. It dictated where people gathered, how they built, and even what they believed about warmth and survival. Yet for all its glow, the fire has a dark side. Smoke curls through the rafters and clings to every surface, leaving black veins on the stone. Your throat itches, your eyes water. Early medieval hearths had no chimneys. The smoke simply drifted upward through a hole in the roof or escaped through open slits in the walls. The air was thick, gritty, and alive with tiny embers. People got used to it, or pretended to. Some even thought the smoke kept away insects and evil spirits. Others just coughed and endured. You move closer to the fire, feeling the prickly heat on your skin. The stones behind you are cold enough to make your back ache. It's strange how the two sensations coexist, warmth and chill, locked in an endless tug-of-war. You think of the masons who built these walls centuries ago. They knew stone was a blessing for defense but a curse for comfort. Heat fled through it like a thief. Still, they made do. They plastered walls, hung tapestries, and learned to live with drafts that would make modern builders weep. Some say the great castles were never meant for cozy living at all. They were fortresses first, homes second. Others argue that their lords, swaddled in fur and pride, didn't mind the chill as much as we imagine. Historians still debate whether medieval people actually felt cold the same way we do, or whether their tolerance was simply greater, shaped by necessity. But when you feel the ice in your lungs tonight, you know the truth. Cold is universal. As you glance around the hall, you notice small details. Rushes, dried plants scattered across the floor crunch softly underfoot, releasing a faint scent of herbs. They help soak up spills and, more importantly, offer a thin layer of insulation against the icy ground. The walls shimmer with the dim light of torches, their iron brackets sweating with heat. Dogs doze near the fire, their bodies curled tight, steam rising faintly from their fur. The crackle of logs fills the space, a kind of slow, sleepy rhythm that could lull you toward drowsiness, if not for the occasional gust that sneaks through the cracks in the doors. Outside, winter presses on. The castle stands like an island in a sea of white, its moat frozen solid, its towers rimed with frost. From the battlements, a guard stamps his feet to keep warm, watching his breath bloom like ghostly smoke in the moonlight. Somewhere beyond the walls, peasants huddle in thatched huts, their own fires burning low, smoke curling up through tiny holes in the roof. Everyone, lord, lady, and labourer alike, is bound by the same unrelenting season. You can almost feel the collective heartbeat of 1,000 winters echoing through time. These people learned to read the cold, to work with it, to build lives around it. Every brick, every fire, every garment was a small act of defiance against nature. You picture yourself here, pulling your cloak tighter, hands outstretched to the fire, cheeks glowing with the reflected light. Somewhere, a lute plays softly, the notes trembling like candle flames. Someone laughs, a sound that feels warmer than the heat itself. And as the hall settles into its nightly rhythm, the castle seems to breathe again. The wind howls outside, but here, in this moment, there's a fragile sense of peace. You realize that warmth in the Middle Ages wasn't just about temperature, it was about togetherness, about faith that spring would return, about refusing to surrender to the dark. So, stay by the hearth a little longer. The night is young, and the fire still burns bright. Tomorrow you'll step deeper into this world of stone and ice, and you'll learn how people fought to keep that spark alive. For now, listen to the wood crackle, feel the smoke swirl around your face, and drift just a little closer to sleep. The cold inside the castle is not just a sensation, it is a living thing. It creeps through cracks, hides in the mortar, and settles into your bones until even breathing feels like swallowing ice. Tonight, as you walk through a narrow passageway lit by wavering torchlight, you begin to understand why medieval builders feared the chill as much as they feared siege or sickness. Stone may have been their shield against arrows, but it was also the perfect conductor of misery. One detail historians widely accept is that castles were rarely as warm as their romantic legends suggest. The grand halls that look magnificent in modern films were, in truth, damp and drafty. Even the most lavish strongholds like Windsor or Crac de Chevalier had cold seeping in through the joints of the stone. The walls, sometimes more than 10 feet thick, held the night air long after sunrise. When you placed your hand against them, it felt like touching the inside of a tomb. An odd little footnote of history tells us that some people believed drafts were not merely uncomfortable but dangerous to the soul. The evil wind, they called it, was said to bring illness, melancholy, or even madness. In certain castles, narrow corridors were hung with thick curtains not only to keep the warmth in but to stop spirits from drifting room to room. The line between superstition and practical heating design blurred like mist over a moat. As you wander through one of these corridors, you notice how sound carries strangely in the cold. Every footstep echoes. Every drip of water sounds like a whisper from the stone. You imagine the masons who shaped these corridors centuries ago, their hands red and raw from winter air, their breath freezing before it reached the floor. They worked knowing their walls would last forever but never be comfortable. According to surviving evidence, medieval builders tried to fight the cold by designing layers of space. A castle was like an onion, cold outer walls, slightly warmer inner rooms, and at the core, chambers close to the hearth. But the principle of heat retention was poorly understood. Warm air rose to the ceilings, leaving the lower parts of the room frigid. People clustered near fires, wrapped in cloaks, and let their breath frost in the air above them. There's ongoing disagreement among experts about whether medieval people fully recognized this flaw or simply accepted it as normal. Some scholars suggest they designed such high ceilings for smoke dispersal rather than warmth. Others think it was about status. A towering hall made you look powerful even if you shivered inside it. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. You run your fingers along the walls, rough and uneven beneath layers of lime wash. The smell of damp earth lingers here, mixed with a faint aroma of ash and animal fat from torches. If you lean close, you can almost hear the walls sigh, exhaling centuries of trapped breath. The air feels alive, ancient and faintly tragic. Now imagine a winter storm battering these walls. The wind whistles through the arrow slits like the breath of a hungry wolf. Outside, snow piles up against the gatehouse, burying the drawbridge in silence. Inside, people retreat deeper into the maze of rooms, lighting more fires, drawing more curtains, building more layers of warmth against the cold. You can see servants carrying bundles of wood, their shoulders hunched, their fingers blackened from soot. The fire is their only weapon, and even that burns fast when the wind drinks from the chimney. A curious custom rarely mentioned is how castle residents used animal hides as temporary insulation. Goat skins, sheep fleeces, even old horse blankets were hung on inner doors or laid along benches. They absorbed warmth and blocked drafts in ways surprisingly effective for the time. A castle, for all its grandeur, was like a living creature wearing layers of fur against the cold. You walk into a stairwell spiraling up toward a turret. The steps are slick with frost, the air colder with each turn. At the top, a narrow arrow slit lets in a thread of pale light. You can see your breath drifting upward, vanishing into the gloom. Somewhere nearby, you hear the faint creak of timbers expanding in the cold. The castle seems to groan, as though even the stone feels tired. Some researchers can't quite agree on whether medieval people saw the cold as punishment or test. In certain chronicles, frost is described as a divine trial meant to strengthen the faithful. In others, it's treated like an enemy to be conquered through ingenuity. What's clear is that the cold shaped their architecture, their routines, and even their faith. Warmth wasn't simply comfort, it was a moral victory. If you close your eyes, you can almost feel that spiritual weight. The stone beneath your feet, the distant hum of the wind, the smoky air, all of it becomes a meditation on endurance. Imagine the countless winters these walls have witnessed. The laughter of knights, the prayers of monks, the weeping of mothers. Every breath ever taken here turned briefly to mist and then vanished into the same air you now breathe. The cold was more than a temperature. It was a teacher, a sculptor, a quiet presence reminding everyone that survival was never guaranteed. Even now, centuries later, when tourists visit castles in daylight and marvel at their beauty, few stop to think about the nights like this one nights when every stone was colder than ice, and the fire in the hall was a trembling promise rather than a guarantee. You stand there for a moment, listening. The wind outside sighs like a forgotten memory. Somewhere, deep in the castle, a fire pops and crackles. The warmth doesn't reach you, but the thought of it does, and that's enough for now. You step into the great hall again, that vast, echoing heart of the castle, where life gathered around a single, roaring flame. The firelight paints the walls in amber and shadow, and every flicker seems to breathe. Here, warmth is not just heat, it is ceremony, order, and belonging. You can feel it even before you reach the hearth, that gravitational pull toward the center of life. One fact nearly every scholar concedes is that the Great Hall's fireplace was both a technological and social invention. Before the 12th century, many castles had open hearths set in the middle of the floor. The smoke climbed lazily toward a hole in the ceiling, filling the room with haze. Later, builders moved the hearth to the wall, added stone hoods, and eventually chimneys, allowing fires to burn hotter and cleaner. This small architectural evolution changed everything. Rooms could grow larger, walls could stay drier, and people could breathe without choking on smoke. A lesser-known curiosity about these halls lies in the way they were arranged around the flame. Everyone had their place. The lord sat nearest the hearth, often elevated on a dais, soaking in the heat and the power it symbolized. The further one sat from the fire, the lower their standing. Warmth became a social map. Even guests could read a household's hierarchy by where they were seated. The peasantry, servants, and guards rarely felt more than the ghost of that heat. You walk closer to the fire now, the sound of crackling wood like soft applause. Sparks dance upward, and your skin tingles in the dry heat. The smell of burning oak mingles with that of roasted meat and spilled ale. It is both intoxicating and exhausting, a sensory overload that seems to press against your mind until you start to feel drowsy. According to surviving accounts, castles consumed an extraordinary amount of fuel each winter. A single great fire might devour several cartloads of wood in a week. Forests near castles often dwindled rapidly, forcing people to collect fuel from miles away. Firewood was a treasure. It kept not only rooms alive but reputations intact. A noble's ability to keep the hearth burning bright through the coldest months spoke of wealth and stability. There's ongoing discussion among experts about how efficiently these fires actually warmed their surroundings. Some argue that most of the heat was lost up the chimney or absorbed by the stone, leaving only a narrow band of true comfort. Others believe that thick tapestries, low ceilings, and layered hangings made the effect surprisingly cozy. Standing here now, you suspect both are right. The front of your body burns while your back freezes. It is a balance medieval people learned to live with. You notice a servant tending the fire, using a long iron poker to shift the logs. His hands are blackened, his eyes red from smoke. He adds another log, and the flames surge. It is an endless cycle. Feed the fire, breathe the warmth, watch it fade, begin again. The act is hypnotic, primal. You realize that this rhythm of tending and replenishing must have shaped their sense of time itself. Hours were counted not by clocks but by how long a fire lasted before another armful of wood was needed. A small but delightful anomaly appears in the form of what they called banked embers. At night, the fire wasn't put out completely. Instead, it was carefully buried under ashes to keep it smouldering until morning. This allowed the household to reignite the flames quickly at dawn without flint or spark. Even the embers, in their way, represented continuity, the promise that warmth would return after darkness. Some medieval writings describe the hearth as sacred space. Fire was not only practical but divine. People offered prayers before lighting it, and ashes were sometimes sprinkled in fields to bless future harvests. It was said that a hearth gone cold foretold misfortune or illness. Imagine the anxiety when smoke failed to rise from the roof of a castle on a winter morning. It was more than a sign of cold. It was a whisper of doom. You lean closer to the fire, feeling the heat pulse against your cheeks. For a moment, you can forget the cold lurking in the corners. The air vibrates softly with voices, the hum of conversation, the faint clatter of wooden cups. There is a kind of peace in this brightness, though it is fragile. The logs will burn down, the warmth will fade. Outside, the night keeps breathing against the stone. Opinions remain divided on whether medieval people viewed fire as friend or hazard. Some chronicles describe entire wings of castles reduced to cinders after a careless ember met straw. Others tell of miraculous survivals, where the blaze seemed to stop just short of a chapel wall, as if faith itself could command the flames. You can picture it, the chaos, the fear, the desperate rush to save relics and banners while snow hissed against smouldering roofs. Fire was always a double-edged companion. And yet, even with all its danger, the hearth remained irresistible. Without it, no meal, no gathering, no life could last through winter. The stone halls, cold and echoing, needed this living center. You imagine yourself sitting near it, hands outstretched, eyelids growing heavy. The world outside fades, replaced by the rhythm of crackling wood and the soft murmur of voices. As the firelight plays across the walls, the shadows seem to move with their own quiet intelligence. You begin to sense why warmth was not only a matter of comfort but also of spirit. It drew people together, held them in fragile harmony, and reminded them that they were not alone in the dark. In this moment you understand what the castle itself knew. Survival depended on staying close to the flame. The air above the great hall still lingers with smoke, curling lazily toward the high beams and stone vaults. You lift your gaze, following the grey spirals as they twist and vanish into the dim roof. It smells of oak, resin, and centuries of human breath. If warmth was the prize, smoke was the tax everyone had to pay. Fire saved you from the cold, but it also filled your lungs, blackened your walls, and shortened your life. According to chroniclers of the time, castles without proper chimneys were often suffocating inside. The earliest hearths had no flues, no vents, just open fires that poured smoke into rooms until the air was barely breathable. People lived in a haze of grey that clung to their hair and clothes. The idea of a chimney, simple as it seems now, took centuries to develop. Once it appeared, it changed medieval architecture forever. Chimneys divided homes into rooms, made upper floors livable, and allowed fires to burn hotter. Yet, even then, smoke never truly disappeared. A curious custom rarely mentioned is how people learned to read smoke like weather. A thick black trail meant damp wood or poor draught. A thin white ribbon meant a good hot burn. Some even claimed they could predict illness by the way smoke swirled inside a room. If it refused to rise, the household would soon face bad luck. If it darted towards someone, it marked them for misfortune. Science and superstition blended in every breath they took. You stand beneath a great beam stained dark with centuries of soot. If you touch it, your fingers come away black. The wood feels almost alive, its surface rippled by age and heat. You realize this beam has survived more winters than you can imagine, watching generations of people cough, cook, and whisper beneath it. The castle's skeleton has literally inhaled its own history. One fact archaeologists often highlight is that smoke acted as an accidental preservative. The layers of soot sealed and hardened the wood, making beams more resistant to rot and insects. The price was air so thick you could barely see across a room. Imagine a feast in full swing, torches burning, fires blazing, the air shimmering with grease and smoke. Your eyes sting, your throat burns, but you stay, because stepping outside means facing a different kind of suffering. There's ongoing disagreement among researchers about when chimneys truly became common across Europe. Some argue they appeared in the 12th century, others point to the 13th or 14th. The timeline is blurred, partly because so few early chimneys survived intact. Many castles were rebuilt, their smoke-stained histories plastered over or lost to collapse. What remains are fragments, a blackened flue, a pile of ash, a few scorch marks in the stone. An unexpected slice of daily life emerges from the smaller fires used in kitchens and guardrooms. These fires weren't grand or ceremonial. They were practical, squeezed into corners, fueled by peat or dried dung when wood was scarce. Their smoke crawled through hidden vents or seeped through cracks, leaving walls streaked and eyes watering. Yet those small fires kept guards awake through endless winter nights. Some say that more lives were saved by a smoking peat fire than any glittering banquet hearth. The smell of smoke here is heavy and oddly comforting. It clings to you, settles into your hair, marks you as part of the household. Servants carried it with them everywhere, a scent of identity. Even nobles smelled of fire and ash. Perfumes and herbs only masked it temporarily. In winter, everyone was branded by the same grey fingerprint. You glance upward again and picture the first mason who dared cut a hole through a castle wall for a flue. What courage that must have taken, to pierce the armour of stone for the sake of cleaner air. According to old building records, such early chimneys were massive, wide enough for a man to crawl inside. They were cleaned by lowering a boy on a rope, his face wrapped in rags, scraping soot with an iron hook. Those boys were the unseen lungs of the castle. Academics continue to puzzle over whether medieval people noticed the long-term effects of smoke inhalation. Records show coughing, eye infections, and a mysterious ailment monks called the black lung of the hearth. Some healers blamed demons, Others thought it was the body's rebellion against cold and smoke alike. Whatever the cause, the castle's inhabitants endured it. To be warm meant to suffer. There was no comfort without consequence. Outside, the wind moans through the battlements, but inside, the castle is wrapped in its smoky cocoon. You can almost see the layers of time drifting through the air, each breath carrying whispers of old fires, forgotten meals, and whispered prayers. The hall feels alive, glowing faintly with memory. One detail carved into medieval archives mentions how nobles displayed their chimneys like trophies. The taller and more ornate the chimney, the greater the household's wealth. Some were carved with coats of arms, saints, or grotesque faces to ward off bad spirits. Fire became a symbol of both luxury and danger. Too much of it, and the castle burned. Too little, and everyone froze. Balance was everything. You sit on a low bench near the wall, feeling the stone cool against your back. The air tastes faintly metallic. Somewhere, the fire hisses as a log shifts, sending a puff of smoke into the room. It wraps around you like a whisper, old and tired but oddly protective. In this dimness, you realize that medieval people didn't just live with smoke, they lived in it. It was part of their air, their rituals, their rhythm of survival. If you close your eyes, the noise fades to a heartbeat of crackling and sighing. You breathe in, and for a moment, you are one of them, your lungs drawing in centuries of history disguised as smoke. The warmth burns your cheeks, the air burns your throat, but somehow it feels right, because in this world, to breathe the fire was to live at all. You step away from the smoky hearth and down a narrow corridor that slopes slightly downward. The air cools quickly, wrapping around you like a damp cloak. Beneath your boots, the floor changes from stone to something softer, something that crunches faintly. You look down and see a carpet of old rushes scattered across the ground, mixed with dried herbs, hay, and perhaps the remains of many winters past. At first it looks careless, but it was part of a centuries-old ritual of survival. One detail historians widely acknowledge is that medieval floors were rarely bare. The stone beneath your feet was too cold, too hard, too unwelcoming for bare skin or even for thick shoes. So people covered it with layers of rushes, straw, or reeds, changed a few times a year if they were lucky. The layer worked as a crude insulation, softening sound, soaking up dampness, and most importantly, trapping a little warmth between the ground and human feet. A small but delightful anomaly appears when you notice what else they mixed into those rushes. Chronicles mention dried lavender, meadowsweet, mint, and even rosemary scattered among the plants. The herbs released faint perfumes when crushed, masking the less pleasant odors of life inside the walls. This was not just decoration, but hygiene by fragrance. Imagine the scent, a strange blend of hay, smoke, sweat, and herbs, equal parts comfort and decay. According to surviving records, replacing rushes was an event. Servants hauled in fresh bundles, spreading them by hand, while older layers were shoveled out and dumped in middens or gardens as compost. In noble households, this might happen 3 or 4 times a year. In poorer halls, perhaps once. Beneath the rushes, vermin sometimes made their homes. Fleas, beetles, and mice thrived in the warmth. Yet people accepted it as the price of living comfortably, or at least less miserably. Some researchers cannot quite agree on how effective rushes were at keeping rooms warm. Modern experiments suggest that a thick mat of dried reeds could indeed provide a little insulation, but much of the benefit was psychological. It separated the body from the cold, made spaces feel more domestic, more alive. Walking across them, you can almost feel the illusion working. The floor seems to breathe under your feet, whispering softly with each step. An odd little footnote of history tells of the royal palaces where rushes became fashion statements. At Westminster, King Henry VIII ordered his rushes mixed with rose petals and orris root for special occasions. Guests described the floors as fragrant enough to make the air shimmer. Others complained that, when left too long, the rushes turned foul, a swamp of rot beneath the perfume. Even royalty could not escape the truth that warmth and decay were close companions. You pause and crouch, letting your fingers brush the dried stalks. They crumble easily, leaving dust on your skin. It smells faintly sweet, like forgotten summer. The stones below are rough and cold, slick with moisture in places where the rushes have thinned. This was the unseen battle fought in every medieval home. Man against stone, warmth against cold, comfort against reality. One fact many scholars point out is that castle floors were layered intentionally. Beneath the rushes, some great halls had wooden planks or packed earth insulated with moss. In wealthier estates, builders even placed flat tiles warmed slightly by fires burning in nearby rooms. The goal was always the same: to keep the frost from creeping up through the ground and into sleeping bodies. There's ongoing disagreement among architectural historians about whether underfloor warmth ever existed before formal heating systems. Some say the great kitchens and bakehouses below the halls naturally heated the floors above. Others dismiss this as coincidence, arguing that the temperature difference was too small. Whatever the truth, those who slept near the kitchens often claimed their rooms were blessedly mild, a rare privilege in a world of stone. A lesser-known curiosity lies in how rushes affected sound. Thick layers, muffled footsteps, and softened echoes. In great halls filled with shouting and music, this mattered. The rustling underfoot gave a strange, organic hum to every movement. When guests entered or servants passed by, the sound was neither silence nor noise, but something gentle in between. It made castles seem less like caverns and more like living bodies with heartbeats made of straw. You imagine the servants sweeping up the old rushes at winter's end. Dust clouds rise, sunlight catching in the air like glitter. The scent of decay mixes with the promise of new herbs. For a moment, the act feels sacred, almost like shedding an old skin. Beneath the grime, the cold stones wait patiently, indifferent and eternal. They have seen this ritual 1,000 times. A curious question still unsettles researchers. Did medieval people ever long for clean, bare floors the way we do today? There are no clear records, only hints in letters and poems. Some travellers from warmer lands mocked northern castles for their rotting floors. Others praised their warmth and fragrance. Perhaps the truth depends on how cold one's feet were that night. You stand again, listening to the faint rustle beneath you. Each step sounds like dry rain. The smell of herbs lingers in the air, mingling with smoke from the hall. For a moment it feels almost cozy. This humble layer of plant life, renewed and replaced, made the difference between endurance and despair. When you walk back toward the fire, you understand something new. Warmth in the Middle Ages wasn't only about heat, it was about texture, smell, and sound. The floor itself became part of the fight against the cold, a fragile but familiar comfort underfoot, and as you move, the rushes sigh softly, as though the castle itself is breathing with you. The next morning arrives pale and quiet. A thin mist clings to the stone, and the world feels suspended between frost and fire. You walk along the inner wall of the great chamber, running your hand over something soft, something that breaks the chill of bare stone. It is heavy, textured, and faintly rough to the touch. A tapestry. Not just decoration, but armor against the winter itself. According to surviving accounts from noble households, tapestries served a double purpose. They were works of art, yes, but also early insulation. Each one was a woven wall, a blanket large enough to keep out the cold that seeped through the castle's limestone skin. Hung on iron rods or wooden pegs, the thick wool or linen absorbed heat from the fires and trapped it close to human bodies. A castle without tapestries was said to feel naked, as if its very bones were exposed to the wind. An odd little curiosity survives from one of the oldest inventories of the English crown. It describes a tapestry so vast it covered an entire wall from ceiling to floor, embroidered with golden threads showing scenes of St. George and his dragon. Its beauty is clear, but the document also notes something practical. The covering kept out the wind from the north. Even kings counted warmth as part of their treasures. You step closer, letting your fingertips trace the weaving. The texture is alive with tiny knots, coarse wool softened by centuries of dust. The colors have faded, but you can still make out the shimmer of blues and reds in the torchlight. The fabric smells faintly of smoke and time. When you lean near, the tapestry moves ever so slightly, breathing with the draft it was meant to conceal. One detail most historians agree upon is that tapestry making reached its height in the late Middle Ages, when workshops in Flanders and France perfected the craft. Nobles commissioned entire sets to tell stories of battles, hunts, or legends. Yet behind the artistry lay a practical instinct. Those thick textiles turned icy chambers into tolerable living spaces. A good tapestry was worth as much for warmth as for pride. Some experts continue to debate whether tapestries truly changed indoor temperature or merely made it feel warmer by cutting the draft. Experiments in reconstructed halls suggest that they worked surprisingly well. The fibers absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly through the night, like silent companions keeping watch while the fire died down. The effect may have been small, but in a castle winter, small mercies mattered. A lesser-known curiosity is that some tapestries were lined with old clothing, scraps of worn-out garments layered inside to add thickness. Others were backed with linen soaked in oil to block the wind. If you peek behind one now, you might find secret stitches, bits of patched fabric, or even forgotten notes from the weavers. Each layer was a message from hands long gone, a conversation across centuries about the universal wish to stay warm. You notice something else as you move along the wall. The sound of your footsteps changes when you walk beside the tapestry. The hall's echo dulls, turning soft and intimate. These woven hangings didn't just keep in heat. They kept out noise, creating little pockets of quiet. Behind them, people whispered, plotted, and sometimes hid. The tapestry became a kind of screen, a veil between worlds. According to evidence from castle inventories, noble families often changed their tapestries seasonally. Summer hangings were lighter, with scenes of greenery or courtly love. Winter ones were thick, dark, and lined with fur. The walls dressed for the weather just as people did. Imagine servants climbing ladders, hammering rods into the stone, unrolling vast panels that smelled of wool and herbs. It was decoration as survival. One well-documented truth from medieval letters tells of how tapestries also displayed power. A visiting guest could read a household's wealth by the fabric that covered its walls. Silk meant luxury. Wool meant practicality. To walk through a corridor lined with embroidery was to walk through a gallery of pride. But even in all that splendor, everyone understood their secret purpose: to keep out the cold breath of winter. Some researchers still discuss how the imagery of warmth influenced the themes of the artwork itself. Many surviving pieces show glowing fires, sunny meadows, or golden robes. Perhaps those who wove them wanted to weave heat into existence, to remind themselves of summer's color in the heart of December. If you stare long enough at a field of stitched gold, you might even start to feel warmer. A small but delightful footnote tells of tapestries treated with fragrant smoke from burning juniper or sage. The scent was thought to purify the air, chase away disease, and make the rooms smell cheerful. Whether it worked or not hardly mattered. The act of perfuming the hangings was an act of hope. Every bit of warmth carried its own ritual. You paused to look around the hall again. The walls that once loomed bare and cold now seem almost gentle, wrapped in color and texture. The firelight ripples across woven figures, hunters, saints, flowers turning them into shifting companions that keep watch as the night deepens. For a moment, it feels as if the walls themselves are dreaming. You imagine what it must have been like to wake on a freezing morning, roll from a heavy bed, and touch a tapestry before dressing. The fabric would be cold at first, then gradually warm beneath your fingers, just enough to remind you that you were alive. It is a simple, human gesture that bridges centuries. Even now, in museums where these same hangings rest behind glass, people stand close to them as though expecting warmth. Perhaps that instinct never left us. We still draw near to what is soft, textured, and handmade, still seek a fragment of comfort in colour and cloth. As you move toward the doorway, a small breeze lifts the corner of one tapestry. It sways, revealing the grey stone behind it, cold and unyielding. You see, in that flicker, the perfect metaphor of castle life. Beauty hiding necessity, art masking survival. The cold never left, it was simply draped in grace. The wind outside returns with a low, mournful sound that makes the shutters rattle. You step closer to the nearest window, curious about how such delicate openings could exist in a fortress built for war. The glass gleams faintly, a patchwork of coloured panes set into lead. You press your hand against it and feel the cold bleed through like a slow sigh. The window is beautiful, but it is also a traitor. According to building accounts from the 13th century, most castle windows were small and narrow, designed for defence rather than comfort. The wide, elegant windows you see in later castles came much later, when security became less urgent than status. In early fortresses, light entered through slits barely wider than your hand, called arrow loops. These openings were miracles of geometry, letting in sunlight while keeping out arrows. Unfortunately, they also let in the wind. A curious custom mentioned in old chronicles tells us how people tried to soften that problem. When the air turned sharp and frost crept in, they covered the slits with oiled parchment, stretched tight across wooden frames. The parchment let in a dull, amber light while blocking the draught. Some households used thin animal horn, polished until translucent. It worked surprisingly well, though the rooms remained dim, filled with a soft, honey-coloured glow. One detail chroniclers agree upon is that real glass was rare and precious for most of the Middle Ages. Only the richest castles and cathedrals could afford it. Each small pane was blown by hand, cut unevenly, and often tinted green or brown. You could see light through it, but not a clear image. The world outside became a blur of colour, as though seen through mist. Yet even this imperfect barrier was enough to make people marvel. There's ongoing discussion among architectural historians about whether stained glass in private chambers was truly practical or purely symbolic. Some argue that it was used only in chapels and halls for beauty and light. Others think that even a thin layer of glass, however costly, was a form of status armor against the cold. To own glass was to hold the sun captive in winter. You stand before a window now, feeling the draught slip through the seams. The edges of the frame are furred with frost, and tiny icicles hang like teeth from the lead strips. Outside, the sky is pale and flat, the snow beyond glowing faintly blue. Inside, the light scatters across the rush-strewn floor, landing in trembling patches of gold. For a moment, the room looks warmer than it is, tricked by sunlight and imagination. An unexpected detail from the past tells how tapestries and curtains were paired with shutters to keep the warmth in. Wooden shutters, thick as shields, were closed at night and barred with iron latches. In some castles, they were lined with fur or leather to block the wind. Servants went room to room at dusk, shutting the windows like eyelids before sleep. The act became part of the nightly rhythm, a ritual of defense against both darkness and cold. You imagine what it must have sounded like. The creak of wood, the clatter of metal, the faint rustle of fabric as the last light vanished behind the panels. Inside, candles flared to life, their flames shivering in the draughts that still found their way through the cracks. One well-documented truth from household inventories reveals that window coverings were not just practical, but beautiful. Embroidered curtains, fringed with gold thread, often bore family crests or patterns of vines. Even as people shivered beneath them, they celebrated the idea of beauty, standing guard against the weather. It was as if art itself could make a room feel warmer. Some modern scholars cannot quite agree on how effective these measures were. Tests on reconstructed windows suggest that parchment stopped little of the wind, yet, psychologically, it mattered. The filtered light softened the harshness of winter and gave each chamber a gentle, candle-lit glow even at noon. People called it holy light, a name that made endurance sound like grace. A lesser-known curiosity survives from a French castle where windows were occasionally stuffed with straw during blizzards. The straw was packed so tightly it blocked nearly all air, turning the room into a shadowy cave. For days afterward, the walls smelled faintly of hay. Servants joked that their masters lived like barn animals, but everyone agreed it was better than freezing. You can almost feel the desperation in such improvisations. Imagine a noblewoman standing by this same window centuries ago, wrapped in wool and fur, watching her own breath cloud the glass. The cold light touches her face, and she sighs, not because of beauty but because of fatigue. Outside, winter stretches endlessly. Inside, her world shrinks to the glow of a fire and the play of colour on the walls. One fact most architectural experts accept is that even the grandest castles lost heat faster through their windows than through any other part of the structure. Thick stone walls could trap warmth for hours, but a single unsealed window could undo it all. It was the weak link in the armour of architecture. The builders knew it, but beauty and pride sometimes won over practicality. You move away from the glass and feel the difference immediately. The air warms slightly as you approach the hearth again. Behind you, the window rattles faintly in the wind, a sound like brittle laughter. The contrast is sharp. Light without warmth, warmth without light. That balance defined medieval life. If you listen closely, you can still hear the faint hum of the outside world pressing at the walls. The castle is a lung, inhaling light and exhaling smoke. Each crack, each seam, each pane of glass is part of that breath. And as you stand here in the soft golden gloom, you realize that the fight against winter was not a war of victory, but of endurance. Every curtain, every shutter, every glowing window was a promise to last one more night. The door in front of you groans when you push it, heavy and reluctant, as if it has been guarding the warmth behind it for centuries. The hinges creak like an old throat clearing itself, and a breath of cold air slips in from the courtyard beyond. You shiver as the draught slides past your ankles, a reminder that in a castle, every door was a battlefield between inside and out. One detail chroniclers consistently mention is that castle doors were built for strength, not comfort. They were thick slabs of oak, often bound with iron bands and studded with nails the size of a man's thumb. They could withstand the blow of a ram or the winter wind, but they offered little mercy to anyone standing nearby. The cold seeped through the gaps like a patient thief. A curious fact from medieval domestic records tells how servants used layers of fabric or animal hides to soften these barriers. When night fell, they hung heavy woolen curtains over doorways, sometimes called portières. The cloth moved gently in the draught, trapping a small pocket of air that acted like insulation. For the people who had to sleep close to the entrance, those layers might mean the difference between a night of rest and a night of shivering. According to written descriptions from castle stewards, every major doorway was a miniature fortress. Some had double doors, inner and outer, with a narrow chamber between them known as a vestibule. In winter, this space worked like an airlock. A servant would step inside, close one door behind him, and then open the other to prevent the full blast of the cold from invading the hall. It was an early and unintentional version of climate control. Some historians still debate whether those heavy drapes were purely functional or also decorative. In grand halls, they were often embroidered with the family's crest or edged with fur, transforming necessity into prestige. In lesser households, the hangings might be nothing more than patched blankets or old cloaks stitched together. Whatever their form, they carried a silent weight, the memory of many winters endured. You run your fingers along the wooden planks of the door. They are rough but warm near the center, smooth where countless hands have pushed and pulled them over the years. The iron handle is cold enough to sting your skin. The smell of resin and age rises from the grain. You can feel the history in it, the rhythm of entry and exit, welcome and warning. A lesser-known curiosity appears in the use of straw or sand piled against the bottom of the door. Servants often pressed these materials into the cracks to stop drafts. On the coldest nights, they even laid strips of fur or old fabric across the threshold. The habit survived for centuries, eventually turning into the modern door snake, that humble roll of fabric still used today to block the wind. One well-documented observation from contemporary visitors to northern Europe was how doors seemed to sing in winter. The contraction of frozen wood made them shriek when opened, a sound that echoed through stone corridors like a living creature. Travelers from warmer countries described it as the voice of the cold. It must have been haunting, that reminder that every entrance came with a price. According to letters from household managers, even the grandest castles had interior doors left open by accident, a careless servant allowing a streak of frost to invade the great hall. Masters would scold them bitterly for it, for in a world without sealed windows or central heating, one open door could undo hours of careful effort to retain heat. Closing doors became an act of duty, a nightly ritual of protection. There's ongoing disagreement among architectural historians about how effective these layered barriers really were. Some argue that the sheer mass of the doors and the fabric around them made a measurable difference. Others believe the effect was minor compared to the heat lost through the roof or chimneys. Still, in the dim torchlight of a freezing hall, even a small reprieve could feel miraculous. A small but delightful detail from an old Welsh account tells of guards who warmed their shields beside the fire before standing watch at the gate. They would then lean against the door, letting the faint stored heat seep into their armor for as long as it lasted. It was a soldier's version of comfort, a fleeting warmth carried like a secret blessing into the cold. You glance at the doorway again and notice something easily missed: the pattern of soot and candle wax that stains the lintel. Over generations, people lit candles near doors to see their way at night, leaving traces of human movement in layers of shadow. The stone glimmers faintly in the flickering light. Every doorway was both a passage and a story, a place where cold and warmth met and traded whispers. One detail recorded in royal building accounts mentions that castle doors were sometimes fitted with thick leather coverings, studded with metal rivets. The leather not only softened the sound of closing but added another layer against the elements. When wet, it swelled and sealed the joints. The design was simple yet brilliant, proof that survival often depended on small acts of cleverness. You take a step back and close the door behind you. The sound echoes through the hall, a dull, comforting thud. The curtain sways, settling into place. The air instantly feels calmer, more contained. It is not warmth exactly, but a kind of stillness that mimics it. For a moment, the castle breathes differently, as if the walls themselves relax. Some researchers point out that this constant tension between inside and outside shaped the very psychology of castle life. To be warm meant to be enclosed, to be protected meant to be sealed away. Every barrier built against the cold also built a barrier between people and the world beyond the walls. Warmth had its price: isolation. You stand quietly, listening to the muffled hum of the fire in the distance. The heavy curtain brushes against your arm as you move away from the doorway. It feels thick and slightly oily from years of smoke. You realize that every thread, every plank, every nail has been part of this long war with the wind. And as you walk deeper into the hall again, you understand what those old doors were trying to teach. Warmth is never a gift in a castle. It is something wrestled from the cold, guarded carefully, and lost the moment you forget to close the way behind you. The air inside the hall carries the scent of roasted meat and mulled wine. Laughter rises above the crackle of flames, and for the first time in this long winter, the castle feels almost alive. Tonight is feast night, a momentary escape from the season's misery. You move closer to the long tables where warmth is not only in the fire, but also in the food and company. One fact recorded faithfully by chroniclers is that medieval feasts served more than hunger. They were designed to keep people warm from the inside out. Hot broths, roasted meats, spiced wine, and thick ale filled the body with heat and spirit alike. Salted pork, fresh bread, and heavy stews rich with onions and root vegetables were staples for surviving the cold. Even the sequence of courses reflected a deep understanding of warmth. The evening began with soups to open the stomach and ended with sweetened wine to seal it with heat. A lesser-known curiosity lies in how drink was treated like medicine during winter. Warm ale mixed with honey, known as posset, was prescribed to soothe the chest and encourage cheerful humours. It was both comfort and cure. Guests would cradle their cups, inhaling the sweet, steamy scent before taking a sip, the rising vapour warming their faces as much as the liquid warmed their hearts. According to letters from travellers visiting northern courts, the great hall during a feast could reach a rare kind of liveliness. The hearth blazed, torches lined the walls, and human bodies themselves became radiant. Heat multiplied in laughter and song. For a few precious hours, the cold outside ceased to exist. You can almost hear the sound now, the scrape of cups, the clatter of knives, the soft hum of a minstrel's lute weaving through the smoky air. There's ongoing discussion among cultural historians about how much these gatherings were about survival versus status. Some argue that the elaborate feasts were designed purely to display wealth and power. Others insist they were practical acts of warmth and morale. In truth, both ideas melt together like butter in wine. The line between necessity and luxury was as thin as the steam that curled from each cup. A curious little detail found in household records shows how even the seating arrangements were part of staying warm. The highest-ranking guests sat closest to the fire and were served the richest dishes, often laced with spices imported from faraway lands. Cinnamon, cloves, and pepper were prized not just for flavor but for their warming properties according to medieval medicine. The further you sat from the hearth, the simpler your meal became, until at the far end of the hall you might be gnawing on cold bread, your breath visible in the air. One well-documented truth from medieval medical theory is that warmth of the body was linked to balance of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Cold foods were thought to make one melancholy, while hot foods revived courage and joy. Cooks followed this logic as faithfully as priests followed scripture. To serve a feast was to practice a kind of alchemy. You glance toward the dais, where the lord of the castle raises his cup. His fur-lined cloak glows in the light of the fire, and his voice carries above the rest as he calls for a toast to the season's endurance. Wine sloshes, laughter erupts, and for a moment even the poorest servant feels the ripple of warmth that moves through the room. A small but fascinating anomaly appears in the practice of heat sharing. In colder castles, guests would sit shoulder to shoulder, not out of affection but efficiency. The closeness trapped warmth, turning each body into part of the insulation. The etiquette manuals of the time even mention proper nearness during winter gatherings, close enough to share warmth, but not so close as to be indecent. It was a fine art of comfort wrapped in civility. Some experts suggest that these feasts also carried a spiritual warmth. In the heart of winter, when nights stretched endlessly, such gatherings reminded people of divine generosity. The act of sharing food was an act of hope, proof that scarcity could be defeated through community. To eat and laugh together was to challenge the cold's dominion. According to monastic observers, the sound of music during such nights was almost medicinal. Drums and pipes thumped through the air, vibrating in the chest like another source of heat. Even those who could not afford fire or furs found warmth in rhythm and motion. Dancing, though rare in the strictest households, became its own kind of defiance. One fact often overlooked is that castles were built with acoustics in mind. The vaulted ceilings and long tables amplified noise, trapping warmth not only in the air but in the sound itself. The great hall was designed to echo with life. In that resonance, even a poor meal could feel like celebration. You take a seat near the lower end of the table, close enough to the door that you can still feel the draught sneaking in, but near enough to the hearth to sense its glow. The table is sticky with spilled ale, the plates chipped and shining in the firelight. The smell of roasted goose fills the air, mingling with the earthy scent of straw and the sweet spice of cinnamon. Around you, faces shine red from drink and heat. For once, no one complains of the cold. As the night deepens, the fire begins to dim, and servants rush to add more wood. The heat flares again, licking the air, and the feast continues in a rhythm that feels older than memory. You realize that warmth here is not a simple thing. It is made of laughter, food, fire, and faith in the coming dawn. It is something built together, bite by bite, song by song. When the last cups are drained and the hall grows quieter, the smell of smoke and spice lingers. You close your eyes, and for a moment you can still taste the sweetness of wine and feel the heat against your face. The feast fades, but the warmth remains, glowing faintly inside you like a coal carried through the night. When the fire has died and the feast has ended, the true test of warmth begins. The laughter fades, the torches dim, and one by one, people retreat to their chambers, wrapping themselves in cloaks and silence. You follow them through shadowed hallways, the air colder with every step, until the only warmth left comes from the layers you wear. According to surviving wardrobe records, medieval people treated clothing as their first defense against winter. Fabric was armor, and layering was strategy. Linen undergarments, thick wool tunics, fur-lined mantles, and heavy cloaks made of sheepskin or fox, each layer trapped air, creating a barrier between the skin and the chill. The wealthy could afford silk linings and soft furs, while commoners relied on coarse wool and ingenuity. Either way, dressing for warmth was a daily ritual of survival. An odd little curiosity buried in fashion history tells of people wearing their garments to bed, especially during the coldest months. Even nobles, whose beds were laden with furs and feather mattresses, often slept fully dressed. Pajamas, as you know them, did not exist. The same tunic worn during the day would keep one alive at night. Some even stuffed straw or wool between layers of fabric to trap more heat, turning themselves into human quilts. One detail most scholars acknowledge is that wool was the medieval miracle fiber. It was warm even when damp, breathable, and available across every class. Shepherds and queens alike depended on it. The lanolin within the fibers made it naturally resistant to water and wind. A cloak woven tightly enough could repel rain, while a looser one could breathe by the fire. You touch your own cloak, and imagine the countless hands that once spun, dyed, and wove such fabric by candlelight, each thread part of someone's struggle against the cold. There is continued debate among textile historians about how much fur was used for warmth versus status. Some claim it was a practical necessity in northern climates, while others argue it was mostly symbolic, an emblem of power wrapped around the body. The truth may lie somewhere in between. Fur warmed the flesh, but it also declared wealth, much as jewels did. A noble woman's ermine collar was as much a proclamation as it was protection. A small but delightful footnote found in old tailors' accounts describes how fur trimmings were often turned inward during travel to preserve heat and outward during ceremony to display beauty. The same cloak could serve two worlds, survival and spectacle. It was a quiet dance between vanity and necessity. According to letters from monastic chroniclers, poorer villagers often made do with whatever nature provided. They wore layered linen stuffed with tow or moss, wrapped their feet in rags, and greased their shoes with tallow to repel moisture. Some even lined their clothing with dried grass during the harshest weeks. These details, so humble and human, remind you that fashion in the Middle Ages was not frivolous. It was life itself, stitched into fabric. One fact that experts often note is that color too played a psychological role in warmth. Deep reds, golds, and greens dominated winter clothing, not only because they showed dyeing skill but because they felt warmer to the eye. In candlelight, these hues glowed, making the room seem less frigid. People instinctively sought brightness against the dull grey of winter, finding warmth in color long before science could explain light and heat. A lesser-known curiosity lies in the treatment of hair and skin as insulation. Chronicles mention people rubbing their faces with animal fat or beeswax to block the wind, especially before traveling on horseback. The practice, though unpleasant by modern standards, prevented frostbite and preserved the skin against the slicing cold. Some used soot mixed with oil as a makeshift salve. The smell must have been terrible, yet it worked. You imagine the layers of sound that came with these clothes, the rustle of linen, the soft brush of fur, the faint squeak of leather boots on stone. Dressing was not silent. It was a ceremony of textures, a daily dialogue with the body about endurance. Every fold had purpose, every clasp and belt a reminder of the season's patience. Some researchers cannot quite agree on whether people ever truly felt warm indoors, no matter how many layers they wore. Diaries suggest that hands and feet were always cold, that even in bed people slept curled tightly to conserve heat. Yet, within that discomfort, they found a strange kind of peace. To live with the cold was to understand one's own fragility. Warmth, when it came, felt sacred. One well-documented example from the wardrobe of Queen Isabella of France reveals garments lined with sable and trimmed in squirrel fur, soft as whispers. Yet the same queen also ordered woolen stockings sewn double, because fashion could not compete with frost. Even the highest born were humbled by the weather. You picture yourself dressing for a medieval winter morning. The linen clings coldly at first, then softens against your skin. The wool tunic goes over it, heavier, comforting, smelling faintly of lanolin and smoke. A belt tightens the layers, keeping heat close. When the cloak finally settles on your shoulders, its weight feels reassuring, almost protective, like a hand resting there. Outside, the wind moans across the towers, but within these layers, you hold a small, private warmth. It is not perfect. It leaks at the sleeves, escapes at the collar, and fades with every step you take. Still, it is yours. And in that simple fact lies the medieval truth. Warmth was never abundance. It was always pursuit. Before you fall asleep that night, wrapped in fur and fatigue, you listen to the muffled quiet of the castle. Somewhere, a door closes softly, a reminder that others too have sought their layers of protection. You feel the rough weave against your cheek and the slow pulse of your own body heat spreading through the fabric. The world outside may be frozen solid, but here, inside your own cocoon, there is life, faint and stubborn. The morning arrives, grey and reluctant. You wake to the sound of footsteps and the clatter of iron. The air bites again, colder than before, and you realize that the warmth from last night's fire has already vanished. Somewhere below, a door slams against the wind. Then you hear it, the rhythmic scrape of shovels, the thud of logs being dropped, and the low murmur of tired voices. The servants of the hearth are already awake. One detail most records agree upon is that the maintenance of warmth in a castle fell to an invisible army. Servants rose before dawn to fetch fuel from the storerooms or woodsheds, their breath steaming in the cold corridors. They carried bundles of wood or sacks of peat on their backs, trudging up and down icy stairs while everyone else still slept. Their labor was the pulse of winter life. Without them, no fire, no comfort, no survival. An unexpected piece of domestic history reveals how entire teams were devoted to this work. In great castles there were wood wardens, charcoal carriers, and ash sweepers. Each had a duty: to feed the flames, to manage the smoke, to keep the ashes from choking the hearth. Their work was dirty, dangerous, and relentless. The smallest mistake, a neglected ember or a damp log, could turn warmth into disaster. According to household inventories, servants were rationed strict amounts of wood for each room. They learned to make it last, stacking logs carefully, judging dryness by touch. The main hall took priority, then the lord's chambers, and only at the end came the servants' quarters, where fires were small and fleeting. Those who worked closest to the flames rarely enjoyed their comfort. They stood beside them only long enough to keep them alive. Some historians still discuss whether castle servants ever grew truly accustomed to the cold. Letters from stewards describe how maids wrapped their hands in cloth while cleaning, how kitchen boys used the heat of ovens to warm their faces between chores. A few even slept in the scullery beside dying embers, too exhausted to climb to their beds. Warmth was a privilege that followed rank like a shadow. A lesser-known curiosity tells of servants carrying portable embers in covered pots, called chafing pots, to bring heat to noble rooms. They moved through corridors like slow-burning lanterns, their faces glowing faintly red in the dark. The smell of ash trailed after them. In some castles, these servants were nicknamed embersmiths, though the term was informal. Their job was both humble and vital, to keep the castle's heart beating one coal at a time. One well-documented account from a Scottish estate notes that servants dried wet firewood by stacking it around the edges of the great hall, using the central fire's heat to prepare tomorrow's supply. It made the room smell of sap and smoke, a scent so familiar that travellers wrote about it with affection. To them, the smell of burning wood was the smell of safety. There's ongoing disagreement among scholars about how these workers viewed their relationship with fire. Some argue that tending flames gave them pride, a sense of quiet authority within the castle's hierarchy. Others suggest it was drudgery, another endless chore like scrubbing floors or hauling water. Both may be true. Fire was unpredictable, but it listened to their hands, and perhaps that gave them a certain power. A small but fascinating footnote describes how servants often read omens in the fire's behavior. If sparks leapt high, they said good news would come. If the flames hissed or leaned away, a storm was on its way. These were not idle superstitions. They were learned observations born from countless hours watching the living breath of fire. In a world without thermometers or forecasts, the hearth itself was the weather's whisperer. You move closer to one of these servants now. His clothes are plain, patched with soot. His fingers are blackened, and his eyes glint in the dim light. He crouches beside the fire, poking the coals, coaxing new life from grey ash. The sound is gentle and rhythmic, almost like breathing. When he sees a spark, his lips move in what might be a prayer. Perhaps he knows that this tiny light will decide how many people shiver tonight. According to surviving payroll records, these workers were among the lowest paid, yet their tasks were indispensable. The irony of medieval life is written right there in the fire. The poorest kept the richest warm. You can almost feel the injustice of it as you watch him work, the heat warming his face for a moment before he stands and disappears back into the cold. Some researchers point out that this labour created a rhythm that defined castle life. Fires were stoked at dawn, banked at dusk, inspected at midnight. The castle never slept completely. Somewhere, at any hour, a servant moved quietly with a poker, checking the embers. It was a ritual as sacred as prayer. One rarely discussed detail reveals that even the ashes were valuable. Once cooled, they were collected for use in soap making, cleaning, or fertilizer. Nothing from the fire was wasted. Every trace of warmth, even in death, was recycled back into the rhythm of survival. You stand by the hearth after the servant leaves. The fire hums gently, a sound that feels both alive and ancient. The warmth on your face is fragile but real. It strikes you how easily this comfort can vanish if left untended. A few moments of neglect, and all that's left is cold stone and silence. You look toward the door, where a faint line of grey light marks the start of morning. The castle will soon stir again. Laughter will return, footsteps will echo, and the fires will blaze high once more. But beneath it all, the servants of the hearth will remain unseen, their work swallowed by the flames they keep alive. In that quiet moment, you understand the truth of medieval warmth. It was not the fire itself that sustained life, but the hands that fed it. Every ember glowed with someone's labour, every spark a testament to endurance. The castle's comfort was not built on stone or wealth alone, but on the simple act of keeping the cold at bay, one breath, one coal, one morning at a time. The castle begins to quiet again after the bustle of morning. You climb a narrow staircase spiralling upward, each step echoing like a heartbeat through the stone. The air grows colder with height. When you reach the upper corridor, the world feels different, emptier, sharper, as if the cold itself is listening. You stop before a thick wooden door and push it open. Inside lies the private chamber of a lord and lady, a smaller world hidden within the larger one. According to surviving architectural plans, these private rooms were designed not for grandeur, but for survival. They were smaller, with low ceilings to trap heat and thick hangings covering the walls. Even the windows were few and tiny. Every detail was meant to conserve the warmth of human breath and the fading embers of the hearth. To live comfortably, you had to shrink your space. A curious fragment from a noblewoman's letter describes how intimacy with cold-shaped daily life. She wrote of retiring early to the little room where the curtains keep the air from trembling, and of falling asleep to the sound of her husband's slow breathing mingling with the wind outside. It paints a picture of tenderness born from necessity. Warmth was not luxury here. It was something two people created together with breath and closeness. One fact most scholars acknowledge is that even in the grandest castles, these private chambers were the only truly warm places at night. Fires burned low but steady, and the heavy bed curtains acted like walls within walls. The difference between comfort and frost could be a single candle's heat, multiplied by fabric, faith, and patience. There's ongoing discussion among architectural historians about how much privacy such chambers actually provided. Some argue that warmth required doors left ajar for the fire's draft. Others note that thick draperies and narrow spaces muffled both sound and air. The balance between comfort and oxygen was delicate. Too tight a room, and you risked smoke. Too open, and you lost heat. Every night became an experiment in balance. A small but delightful curiosity found in old housekeeping manuals tells how servants sometimes slept just outside the lord's door, their own blankets tucked around their heads. Their presence wasn't just about duty. It helped block the drafts from creeping under the threshold. Human warmth became a barrier as practical as any curtain. You glance around the chamber. The walls are covered with faded fabric embroidered with vines and lions. The air smells faintly of beeswax, wool, and damp stone. In the corner, a small hearth crackles quietly, the flames reflecting in a polished brass bowl. A fur-lined chair sits near it, its seat worn smooth. The bed dominates the room, high and thick, its canopy like a ship's sail pulled taut above. According to chroniclers of the period, noble families often withdrew to these smaller rooms after supper, leaving the great hall to the servants. They would read prayers, talk softly, or simply sit by the fire until their candles burned low. The hearth became a symbol of intimacy rather than grandeur. Its warmth belonged not to crowds but to quiet companionship. Some researchers still discuss whether the architecture of such rooms was influenced by monastic design. The smallness, the order, the sense of enclosure all resemble the cells of monks who valued stillness and warmth in equal measure. Perhaps the noble chamber was a secular echo of that sacred simplicity. A lesser-known curiosity, found in a 13th-century French account, mentions that some rooms had built-in benches along the walls, lined with cushions and fur. Families gathered there to talk, mend clothes, or play music while waiting for sleep. The heat from the fire would drift upward, caught beneath the canopy, wrapping the space in a fragile bubble of comfort. One widely accepted observation from castle excavations shows that many private rooms were located near kitchens or storerooms, places that generated residual heat. Builders understood this instinctively. The warmth that fed the bread ovens below also crept through the floors into sleeping quarters above. To be near food was to be near life. An odd but charming note from an Italian visitor to England describes how noble women in cold castles wore gloves to bed and small linen caps to trap warmth from their heads. Some even tucked heated stones wrapped in cloth at their feet. He found it absurd, but also strangely graceful, like a ritual of endurance wrapped in gentleness. You move toward the narrow window and pull aside the curtain. Outside, the courtyard glitters with frost. You can hear distant voices muffled by snow. When you breathe, the glass fogs slightly, a faint trace of your existence in the icy air. Behind you, the fire pops, sending a soft spark of light through the gloom. According to preserved etiquette books, visiting another person's private chamber was a mark of deep trust. These rooms were the human heart of the castle, places where laughter was quiet, where tears could fall unseen, and where the cold of the world stopped at the door. The intimacy of warmth shaped not only the body but also relationships. To share heat was to share life itself. Some scholars propose that the idea of home as a personal refuge began in chambers like this one. Before then, comfort belonged to the collective hall. Afterward, it belonged to the individual room. In that shift, warmth became private. The castle, for all its size, learned to hold intimacy inside small spaces. You stand there for a moment, listening to the fire crackle softly. The fabric above the bed stirs faintly, breathing with the warmth that fills the room. It is imperfect and temporary, but it is enough. The air is not truly warm, yet it feels like safety. You realize that medieval people, like us, sought not just to survive the cold but to create comfort where none should exist. They built small worlds within large walls, tiny sanctuaries glowing faintly against the dark. Every private chamber was an act of hope. The chamber grows quiet now, the fire low and steady, its light breathing across the walls like the pulse of a sleeping creature. You step closer to the great bed at the center of the room. It looks enormous, heavy enough to anchor the entire night. The air near it feels softer, and the scent of linen and fur mingles with the faint smoke from the hearth. This is where the last battle with the cold was fought, the bed as fortress. One fact nearly every historian agrees upon is that the medieval bed was an engineering marvel for warmth. Far from the simple cots of peasant huts, castle beds were elaborate constructions of wood, feathers, and fabric designed to trap every possible trace of heat. The frames were raised high off the ground to avoid the chill that crept along the floor. Curtains hung from a canopy overhead, enclosing the sleeper like the walls of a tent. The idea was simple: make the smallest, warmest world possible within a vast, freezing chamber. A small but fascinating curiosity recorded in a 15th century household manual describes how people made the bed in ways unlike today. Servants layered straw mattresses with woolen covers, feather beds, and fur throws, then shook everything to trap air between the layers. Linen sheets went on last, cool to the touch but quick to warm. When complete, the bed stood almost as tall as a table. The sleeper climbed into it using a stool, vanishing behind the thick curtains. According to surviving correspondence from noblewomen, bed curtains were among a household's most prized possessions. They were woven of wool, velvet, or even silk in rich colors that glowed faintly by candlelight. Once drawn closed, they kept out both drafts and insects, while the heat of two breathing bodies made the space inside surprisingly warm. To enter such a bed was to step into a private season, a pocket of spring in the heart of winter. There's ongoing debate among textile scholars about whether the warmth of these beds was purely practical or had ritual meaning. Some argue that the enclosure symbolized protection, mirroring the castle's own defensive design. Others believe it reflected religious imagery, a cocoon of purity against the world's darkness. Either way, when the curtains closed, the room ceased to exist. The sleeper belonged only to the hush of fabric and breath. An odd little detail found in the diary of a traveling clerk reveals how bed curtains sometimes became conversation walls. Servants whispered behind them, lovers plotted secrets, and prayers were murmured before sleep. The fabric muted the world, turning words into private smoke. A curtain was never just cloth. It was the threshold between awareness and dream. One well-documented truth from castle inventories is that bed coverings were seasonal. In summer, light sheets of linen and silk kept the body cool. In winter, layers of fur fox, beaver, or even bear were added until the weight pressed down like gentle armor. People often spoke of feeling the bed's hug, a phrase that perfectly captures the comfort of being sealed away from frost. A lesser-known curiosity describes how some households placed heated stones at the foot of the bed. These were wrapped in cloth or placed inside small boxes of brass or clay. The stones, warmed by the hearth, radiated heat for hours, turning icy sheets into something close to bliss. The idea was so effective that variations of it survived for centuries in the form of bed warmers. According to old French inventories, the wealthy even perfumed their beds with dried lavender, cloves, or crushed roses, believing that pleasant smells brought good dreams and clean spirits. The warmth released those scents slowly, filling the curtained chamber with a faint, spicy sweetness. You can almost smell it now, mingled with the smoke and the cold that still lingers beyond the fabric. Some researchers still discuss whether couples truly shared beds nightly or only for company and warmth. Diaries hint that during the worst winters, even servants or children might be invited under the same blanket. In those moments, social distance vanished. The bed was democracy by necessity. Everyone, noble or not, needed heat. One fact frequently noted by historians of domestic life is that beds were valuable enough to be listed in wills. They were symbols of continuity, passed from generation to generation, their wood darkened by time, and their fabrics renewed each season. Within their canopies, entire lifetimes unfolded births, illnesses, secrets, prayers. You stand beside one now. The curtains sway slightly as the fire sighs. When you brush the cloth aside, the space within glows softly with candlelight. The mattress yields under your hand, warm where someone has just lain. You can almost hear the quiet breathing of the night before, still folded into the air. According to written accounts, before sleeping, people often recited blessings for warmth. Short, half-spoken prayers thanking God for the gift of the flame and the rest of the flesh. It was not superstition but gratitude, a way of acknowledging that comfort was never guaranteed. A curious question still unsettles scholars. How did people endure such confined heat without feeling trapped? Perhaps confinement was comfort to them. After facing the vastness of cold stone halls, the intimacy of a curtained bed must have felt like a miracle. You step inside and draw the curtains. The world outside disappears. The flicker of the fire becomes a faint orange glow through the fabric. The air inside is thicker, warmer, filled with the smell of linen and human breath. It feels safe, almost timeless. Lying here, you understand what warmth truly meant in a medieval winter. It was not about conquering the cold, but about learning to live beside it, to carve small sanctuaries from its reach. The bed was the final fortress, built not of stone but of softness, where sleep became an act of survival and comfort a quiet victory. When morning comes, the air inside the bed curtains is still warm, but the moment you lift the fabric, the chill rushes in like an intruder. You sit up and see your breath drift into the pale light. The fire in the small hearth has died, leaving behind a faint scent of ash and smoke. For a moment, all you hear is the silence of stone, the kind that feels alive in its stillness. You run your fingers along the wall beside the bed and feel moisture clinging there. The stone is breathing. One detail archaeologists often note is that medieval stone walls were not as lifeless as they seemed. They absorbed water from the air and released it again with every shift of temperature. In winter, the damp made them clammy and cold to the touch, sometimes even slick with condensation. Builders learned to respect this living nature of stone, for while it guarded them from enemies, it also allowed the cold to creep slowly inward, a silent invader that could never truly be stopped. A curious observation found in an old mason's notebook describes how craftsmen tried to give the walls a kind of protection. They mixed lime, sand, and sometimes ground oyster shells to create a porous plaster that let the stone breathe. This prevented it from cracking under the stress of frost, but it also made heating a room nearly impossible. Warm air simply slipped through the walls, drawn toward the promise of the outside. The masons called it the exhale of the castle. According to surviving construction accounts, thick walls, often 10 feet deep at the base, were both blessing and burden. They stored heat during the day but released it unevenly, creating cold corners and unexpected drafts. A fire could burn for hours, yet one side of a chamber might still feel like the inside of an icebox. The very architecture that protected the castle's people also betrayed them, trading comfort for safety. Some modern engineers studying these structures still argue over whether masons understood the science behind their work. Some claim they did, learning through experience how to shape openings and angles to let air flow gently rather than fiercely. Others insist that most of it was luck and persistence. The truth, perhaps, lies in between, an intuition born from centuries of living with stone. A lesser-known curiosity appears in the use of reed mats or wood panels against the walls. Servants sometimes nailed thin planks or hung fabric to keep dampness from reaching the furniture. In a few surviving castles, faint marks on the stone show where these panels once were. They created a small gap that trapped warmer air, an early experiment in insulation that later evolved into full wall linings. It was a simple, clever attempt to outwit the stone's breath. One well-documented truth from restoration records is that castles were never truly silent in winter. As the temperature dropped, the stones groaned softly, expanding and contracting with the changing air. The sound was low and resonant, a deep pulse through the walls. People living inside grew used to it, calling it the castle's heartbeat. The idea that their home was alive brought both comfort and unease. You walk closer to the window slit, where frost feathers have formed delicate patterns on the stone. Light trickles through, catching the thin ice and scattering it into tiny rainbows. You place your palm flat against the wall and feel how it draws warmth from your skin. It is as if the castle itself is quietly feeding on your body heat. According to the notes of early architects, the shape of rooms was chosen as much for temperature as for defense. Rounded corners and vaulted ceilings encouraged airflow, while small, square chambers trapped heat more effectively. The Great Hall might impress visitors, but the real warmth was hidden in the smaller spaces where the air could not escape. In those rooms, you can almost feel the logic of survival etched into every joint. An odd but charming story from a 14th century diary tells of a servant who swore he could hear the castle whisper on certain nights. He believed the stones remembered every fire that had ever burned against them. The idea seems fanciful, yet when you stand here, surrounded by cold walls that once glowed with heat, it is hard not to believe that memory lingers in the stone itself. Some researchers still discuss how the choice of building material affected warmth. Granite held cold for days. Sandstone absorbed moisture. Limestone, while easier to carve, seemed to drink in draughts. A few rare castles built near volcanic rock stayed warmer than others, their walls faintly radiant in winter. Nature decided who would shiver and who would sleep in comfort. A small but fascinating footnote in building history notes that masons sometimes carved thin vertical channels inside the walls, not for decoration but to allow trapped air to circulate. When fires burned below, the air would rise through these hidden veins, carrying a hint of warmth upward. It was primitive engineering, centuries ahead of its time. You imagine a mason standing on scaffolding, hammer in hand, breathing white clouds into the freezing air. He chips away at the wall, layer by layer, building not just a fortress but a breathing organism. His hands are numb, yet he smiles, knowing that his work will outlast him by generations. The warmth of his body passes into the stone with every blow. According to conservation experts, some of that warmth is still there. Modern instruments detect traces of residual heat deep within old walls, tiny pockets of energy stored from centuries of fires. The castle remembers. It is a slow memory, one that hums beneath your fingertips even now. You take a step back, letting the cold reclaim your hand. The wall glistens faintly in the firelight, as if exhaling the breath you just gave it. You realize that medieval people must have sensed this same strange exchange, the living rhythm between human and stone. They built their homes not against nature, but in uneasy partnership with it. The warmth of a castle was never contained. It was borrowed from life itself, always leaking away into the walls. always needing to be renewed. To live here was to understand that endurance meant coexistence with the cold. As the fire behind you crackles again, you look once more at the stone, shimmering faintly like old skin in the light. It is both enemy and ally, both grave and guardian. You breathe out, and the stone seems to breathe with you. Night falls again, and the castle settles into its slow rhythm of sighs and flickers. The main fires are banked, their light dimmed to glowing coals. The halls grow quiet except for the occasional pop from the embers and the muffled footsteps of a servant carrying a small clay pot. You follow the faint orange glow through the corridor until the figure disappears around a corner. When you reach the spot, you see what he was holding. A brazier, small and round, glowing softly like a captured sunset. According to detailed household records, braziers were among the most practical inventions for winter life in castles. They were portable containers, often made of iron, bronze, or even clay, filled with hot coals or embers taken from the main fire. People used them to heat small rooms, hands or feet, and sometimes even to warm beds before sleep. In a world of unyielding stone and endless drafts, a brazier was a miracle you could carry. A curious mention in a 13th century letter describes how these devices became status symbols as well as necessities. Wealthy nobles owned ornate braziers engraved with family crests or biblical scenes, while servants and guards made do with simple clay bowls. The heat was the same, but the vessel became a reflection of pride. Some nobles even added fragrant herbs to the coals to perfume the air, turning warmth into luxury. One well-documented truth from medieval household accounts is that braziers were both useful and dangerous. Left unattended, they could ignite tapestries or rushes on the floor. Many castle fires began with a careless ember rolling loose in the night. Some chroniclers wrote of entire chambers burning while their occupants slept, their dreams ending in smoke. It was warmth with a price, a constant gamble between comfort and catastrophe. There is ongoing discussion among historians about how widespread brazier use really was. Some argue that only the wealthiest households could afford the fuel required to keep them glowing through long nights. Others insist that smaller, simpler versions were found even in humbler homes, proof that necessity drives invention faster than luxury ever can. The truth probably rests somewhere in the middle, an invention born in wealth but adopted by survival. An odd but endearing custom recorded in English and Italian estates tells how servants carried braziers from room to room when their lords moved through the castle. The glowing pot acted like a personal sun, lighting the floor and warming the air just enough to make passage bearable. When the master stopped to speak, the servant would set it down carefully, crouching nearby to feed it with a pair of iron tongs. It was a quiet ballet of light and service. A lesser-known curiosity lies in the small clay hand-warmers used by women who embroidered or read by the hearth. These little pots, no larger than apples, were filled with coals and wrapped in cloth. They could be slipped into sleeves or placed under skirts, radiating warmth through layers of fabric. One noblewoman's diary describes her delight at holding the small heat that follows me like a friend. According to archaeological findings, some castles also used pots of heated sand or ash for a similar purpose. They were safer than open coals but cooled more quickly. When mixed with salt or herbs, the scent was said to calm nerves and aid sleep. The line between comfort and ritual blurred again. Warmth was as much about emotion as temperature. One recorded fact from a northern monastery reveals a clever variation. Monks used earthen pots buried under benches to keep the stone seats warm during long winter prayers. The gentle heat rose through the wood, warding off the chill without the smoke of open fires. It was early, quiet innovation heat without flame. A small but charming anecdote from a French castle tells of travellers arriving half-frozen, greeted not with words but with a brazier placed at their feet. Before wine or bread came warmth. Hospitality began with fire, and the moment they felt its glow, the tension in their faces melted away. The host's generosity was measured not by how much he fed you, but by how well he warmed you. Some modern historians like to call this the first form of central heating, though in truth it was anything but central. The castle was a constellation of tiny suns, each brazier or ember pot a glowing island of life in a sea of cold. Walking through it at night, you would see them flicker through half-open doors, little hearts of fire beating quietly in the dark. According to the records of early household stewards, braziers also helped with cooking when kitchens were too cold or when servants wanted to reheat food for their masters. Small pots simmered over the coals, releasing the smell of broth, wine, or melted wax. Even the faintest warmth of that smoke made the hall feel less harsh. Some scholars continue to debate whether the use of braziers indoors affected the air's quality. Soot and carbon filled the chambers, and without proper ventilation, the fumes could cause headaches or worse. It was a slow poison everyone accepted as part of life. Clean air and heat rarely coexisted. You kneel beside the brazier, holding your hands above it. The heat is modest but comforting. It smells of iron and wood and something faintly sweet, perhaps herbs smouldering in the coals. The warmth spreads slowly through your fingers, up your arms, until your heartbeat seems to sync with the crackle of the embers. It feels personal, like a secret shared between you and the fire. A tiny spark leaps from the brazier, landing harmlessly on the floor. You watch it fade to grey, and for a moment, you think of how fragile this balance always was. Every ember in this castle represents a promise, to keep burning until morning, to keep the cold from winning. You rise and take one last look at the glowing coals. The servant has returned, his face lit by the faint red light. He lifts the brazier carefully, cradling it like something holy, and disappears into another corridor. The sound of his footsteps fades, leaving you with the fading scent of warmth. In that quiet, you understand that the medieval struggle with the cold was not just architectural or technological, it was spiritual. Every flame was an act of faith, every brazier a declaration that the dark would not have the last word. The corridors smell faintly of damp wool and candle wax as you make your way toward the chapel at the edge of the courtyard. The air here feels different, quieter, touched by incense instead of smoke. The monks move slowly through the space, their sandals whispering over the stone. Even in the middle of winter, their faces seem calm, their movements measured. You pause to wonder how they manage it, for the cold in this place could stop a heartbeat. According to surviving monastic records, religious houses were the first to experiment with more sophisticated ways to stay warm. Cloisters and abbeys often hid clever systems beneath their quiet surfaces. Warm air was channeled through flues or pipes running below floors, carrying heat from kitchens or furnaces into rooms where monks studied and prayed. It was an early form of radiant heating, centuries before such ideas became science. The monks may not have known the physics, but they understood the comfort of warmth spreading from the ground up. A curious discovery in a Benedictine abbey in France revealed one such system: stone channels built under the refectory floor, where the brothers took their meals. Hot air from the kitchen fires below rose through these passages, warming the stones enough for bare feet to walk on them without freezing. The builders called this invention a hypocaust, borrowed from ancient Roman design. In many ways, the monks were keepers not only of faith, but of forgotten knowledge. One fact nearly all scholars acknowledge is that monasteries preserved practical wisdom about comfort that castles sometimes ignored. Their lives demanded endurance, but also efficiency. A freezing monk could not pray or copy manuscripts for long. They learned how to use heat sparingly, directing it where it mattered most: the library, the scriptorium, and the infirmary. There is continued discussion among architectural historians about whether these systems were common or exceptional. Some argue that most monasteries relied only on large hearths and thick clothing. Others point to archaeological evidence of complex networks of vents and ducts. Perhaps, as in many things medieval, it depended on wealth and geography. A Cistercian abbey in England might shiver through the cold, while a Benedictine house in France enjoyed mild floors underfoot. A lesser-known curiosity comes from the infirmaries attached to many abbeys. There, heating was treated almost as medicine. Warm stones, poultices, and even gentle steam baths were used to ease illness. In some monasteries, special chambers were built to hold warm air like invisible blankets, providing comfort to the weak and dying. Warmth and healing were seen as siblings, gifts that came from both fire and prayer. According to the writings of an abbot from Canterbury, heat was to be used with humility. Excessive comfort, he warned, tempted the spirit to laziness. Fires were banked low, rooms left cool enough to remind the body of discipline. Yet even in austerity, they sought balance. Candles flickered in every corner, and the faint scent of wax mixed with incense gave an illusion of warmth that soothed the senses as much as the body. An odd but touching account from a novice's diary describes how the monks took turns, keeping the library warm at night. One brother stayed awake, feeding a small brazier near the manuscripts so the ink would not freeze or the vellum crack. He called the task guarding the word from winter. You can almost picture him there now, a solitary figure bathed in red glow, whispering psalms to the silence. Some researchers still puzzle over how these religious communities managed to balance simplicity with invention. Their vows forbade luxury, yet their ingenuity rivaled that of kings. In many ways, their pursuit of warmth was an extension of their pursuit of order. Cold was chaos, fire was discipline. Keeping the flame steady became a metaphor for keeping faith steady too. One detail recorded in building accounts from a Welsh abbey describes an ingenious system for conserving heat. Stones around the fireplaces were hollowed slightly, so that water placed nearby would warm for washing without boiling away. The monks called them sleeping stones. At dawn, when they rose for prayer, the water was still warm enough to use. It was a small triumph over the long, merciless night. A small but delightful detail survives from a monastic garden journal. The monks planted rosemary and thyme near the walls not just for cooking or medicine, but because their scent lingered in winter air, reminding them of warmer months. As the heat from the building leaked into the soil, those herbs thrived even when frost covered the rest of the ground. The boundary between warmth and cold became a living garden. You walk slowly through the cloister now, your breath forming tiny clouds. The sunlight streaming through the narrow arches feels gentle on your face, though it holds no real heat. The stone beneath your feet is cold but not unbearable. Perhaps the hidden channels below still remember their old purpose. Somewhere nearby, a monk hums softly, his voice low and steady. According to religious writings, warmth was often seen as divine favor. The fire of the hearth was compared to the fire of the soul, both needing care, both easily extinguished by neglect. When monks prayed beside a glowing brazier, they saw not just comfort but a symbol of inner light. The body's heat and the spirit's flame were one and the same. Some modern theologians suggest that this connection between fire and faith shaped how people later viewed the hearth in secular life. Even in castles, the language of warmth became spiritual, the light of home, the fire of love. What began in monasteries as metaphor soon found its way into poetry and domestic life. You pause in the center of the cloister, feeling the faint warmth radiating from the stones beneath your boots. It is old heat, stored from centuries of fires, prayers, and footsteps. For a moment, you understand how those monks endured the endless winters. They did not fight the cold, they turned it into part of their rhythm. Each chill reminded them to light another candle, to share another bowl of broth, to speak another word of comfort. You close your eyes, listening to the quiet crackle of a distant fire and the slow echo of footsteps fading into the chapel. The air smells of wood smoke and sanctity. Here, in this place of discipline and devotion, warmth feels like grace itself earned, fragile and deeply human. The air shifts again as you descend a narrow stone stairway spiraling into the belly of the castle. The sound of the wind fades above you, replaced by the low, steady hum of enclosed space. The deeper you go, the warmer it feels, though no fire burns here. A faint scent of bread and smoke lingers in the air, mingling with damp earth. You have entered the castle's hidden lungs, the kitchens, tunnels, and cellars that kept the entire fortress alive. According to surviving blueprints and excavations, these underground areas were more than storage. They were the silent machinery of warmth, the unseen networks through which heat moved and gathered. Kitchens, in particular, acted as the castle's furnace. The stone floors above them grew warm to the touch, and servants who worked in upper rooms prized those spaces where the heat rose naturally from the labor below. In winter, these lower levels were often the only places where the air felt almost comfortable. A curious note in a steward's journal from a French fortress tells how servants lingered in the kitchens long after their duties were done, not just for the smell of roasting meat, but for the comfort of the heat that never died. He wrote that, "The cook's fire is the mother of all our warmth." In a way, that was true. Every meal cooked, every loaf baked, added another heartbeat to the castle's inner temperature. One detail most scholars acknowledge is that medieval builders understood the power of heat circulation, even if they did not name it as such. Long corridors and vents connected the hot rooms with colder ones. The flow of warm air was accidental yet essential. The servants' passages, often thought of as purely practical, were also arteries of comfort, carrying faint warmth wherever they led. Some experts continue to debate whether this heat was intentionally designed or simply discovered through living experience. There are signs of planning: channels carved into walls, vent holes shaped to draw smoke upward, kitchens placed beneath sleeping chambers. But perhaps it was both instinct and necessity, the kind of quiet intelligence that came from centuries of endurance. A lesser-known curiosity from an English castle mentions the baking vaults, low-arched rooms where ovens stayed hot for days after use. Servants sometimes slept near them, leaning against the warm stone to rest their backs. The records note it without judgment, as if this makeshift comfort was simply part of castle life. Those who worked closest to the heat rarely had chambers of their own. They found warmth wherever the walls exhaled it. According to the writings of a 15th-century cook, the rhythm of the kitchen never truly stopped. Bread was baked before dawn, meats roasted at noon, and broths simmered through the night. Fires were kept burning constantly, both to preserve the food and to ensure that the temperature never fell low enough to freeze the stored supplies. In a winter siege, the heat of the kitchens could mean the difference between life and death. One small but fascinating footnote comes from the design of underground tunnels that connected different wings of large castles. These passages were narrow and low, built to trap air. As servants hurried through them carrying pots, water, and coal, their combined movement stirred the warmth from one place to another. Even their breath added to the subtle temperature rise. Some modern restorations still record a few degrees of warmth in these tunnels long after the fires above have gone out. There is continued discussion among conservation architects about whether this heat distribution was deliberate. Some argue that kitchens were placed underground purely for safety, to reduce fire risk. Others see intent, noting how so many castles positioned them near central walls or beneath the lord's apartments. The question may never be settled, but the result remains the same. The castle's body warmed itself from within. An odd but touching account survives from a German servant who worked in the wine cellars. He wrote that in winter the casks sweated slightly, beads of moisture gathering on their sides as the air inside grew warmer than the stone outside. He called it the castle's breath and swore it was proof that the building was alive. You can almost imagine it, the slow pulse of air through tunnels, the faint murmur of heat finding its path. A well-documented discovery in several excavated castles shows traces of charcoal in unlikely places, hidden pits beneath hallways or beside stairwells. These were warming holes, small caches where embers or heated stones were kept to temper the cold that rose through the floors. The system was simple but effective, a quiet companion to the larger fires that roared above. A smaller curiosity comes from the kitchen floors themselves. Some were built slightly hollow, filled with sand and ash beneath the tiles to retain heat. When the ovens glowed red, the warmth would seep into this layer, and radiate slowly through the night. Servants could walk barefoot there without freezing, a rare luxury in the age of stone. According to household accounts, even the castle's animals shared this warmth. Dogs and cats slept near ovens. Stable boys brought small beasts into the lower corridors during snowstorms, and horses were sometimes stabled beside the outer kitchens to share the rising heat through thin walls. In this hidden network of life, every creature borrowed the same breath. Some researchers note that the concept of using one part of a building to heat another did not disappear after the Middle Ages. It quietly shaped later architecture, from manor houses to monasteries, where the kitchens again became the heart of the home. The idea of living warmth that spread naturally rather than mechanically was born here, in these smoky corridors and low rooms. You walk slowly through one of those tunnels now. The walls are slick, glistening faintly in the torchlight. The air is close, but not unpleasant. A faint heat radiates from the stones, and you hear distant echoes of pots clanging, voices murmuring, and the hiss of boiling water. The warmth is subtle, almost invisible, but it is everywhere, threading through the castle like an unseen spirit. When you emerge into the main hall again, the difference is clear. The air above feels thinner, the cold sharper. Yet you know now that the castle's life depends on what happens below, in those quiet, unseen spaces. Every breath of warmth that reaches the upper chambers begins down there, in the flicker of kitchen fires, in the glow of ovens, in the ceaseless work of those who fed both body and flame. The castle, you realize, was not simply a structure but a living organism. It breathed through its tunnels, exhaled through its chimneys, and carried heat like blood through its stone veins. And at its heart, beneath the weight of towers and banners, burned the steady pulse of human effort, the hidden fire that kept the world from freezing. Steam curls through the air as you step into a different part of the castle. The smell of herbs and heated water hits you first, soft and earthy. The air feels heavy, almost tropical compared to the chill outside. You blink, surprised by the warmth that wraps around you like a living thing. Before you, a small chamber glows with candlelight reflecting off damp stone. This is the bathhouse, one of the rarest and most luxurious spaces in any medieval fortress. According to royal household records, bathing in the Middle Ages was not an everyday affair but a ritual event, combining comfort, health, and even ceremony. Large castles often included special rooms for bathing, though they were used only occasionally. Fires beneath the floors or beside great copper tubs heated the water, while servants carried steaming buckets from the kitchens below. The scent of boiling rosemary and sage filled the air, both to mask odors and to purify the spirit. A curious account from a 13th century English noblewoman describes how she bathed on the feast of St. Agnes in a tub lined with linen and covered with a canopy of silk. The water was scented with rose petals and marjoram, a rare indulgence in a time when most people washed only their hands and faces daily. Bathing was not merely cleanliness, it was rebirth through warmth. One fact most historians agree on is that bathing customs varied widely across Europe. In some regions, influenced by lingering Roman traditions, public or private bathhouses continued to thrive well into the Middle Ages. In others, especially during harsh northern winters, people avoided full immersion, fearing illness from the shock of cold air afterward. Yet wherever it survived, the bath was a moment of reprieve, a pocket of summer hidden behind stone walls. There is continued debate among scholars about whether medieval people truly avoided bathing out of superstition or simply out of practicality. Some argue that frequent washing was considered dangerous because it opened the pores to disease. Others point out that soap, water, and heat were costly and hard to maintain. The truth, as always, is tangled between fear and limitation. But those who could afford the luxury of hot water often embraced it wholeheartedly. A lesser-known curiosity lies in how these baths were prepared. Servants would first heat large cauldrons in the kitchen, then carry them upstairs and pour them into wooden tubs lined with cloth to prevent leaks. The process could take hours, By the time the bath was ready, the entire room would be misted with steam, turning the stone walls into glowing mirrors of condensation. For the briefest time, the cold was forgotten. According to the diaries of knights returning from the Crusades, bathing customs in the East deeply impressed them. They wrote of hammams filled with scented steam and polished marble floors that held heat long after the fires died. Some brought these ideas back with them, inspiring the design of bath chambers in later European castles. In this way, warmth became a kind of cultural inheritance, passed across continents through trade, travel, and admiration. One charming fragment from a household manual advises mixing honey into bath water for sweetness of skin and gladness of heart. Such details reveal that even amid hardship, people longed for comfort that went beyond survival. The bath was both practical and poetic, a reminder that warmth could also be pleasure. An odd but vivid story from a German castle tells of lords and ladies bathing together during the Yuletide season. The water perfumed with spices saved all year for the feast. Musicians played softly while servants poured more hot water, and the air shimmered with laughter and the faint glitter of candlelight on water. For a few hours, the boundary between stone and flesh dissolved. The castle itself seemed to relax. One well-documented truth from later centuries shows how bathhouses began to serve medicinal purposes. Physicians prescribed hot baths mixed with herbs or minerals to cure melancholy, stiffness, or even spiritual weariness. Warmth became medicine, a treatment as much for the mind as the body. The healing power of heat, so instinctively understood, became a science of its own. Some modern researchers have found remnants of stone basins and drainage channels in castle ruins, evidence that such places were more common than once believed. The baths were often small, carved into the foundations near kitchens or storerooms, where water could be heated easily. Even a shallow basin of warm water was enough to make a difference, to bring comfort to bones stiffened by endless cold. According to descriptions from traveling clerics, communal baths sometimes included conversation and song. Voices echoed off the stone, laughter mingling with the splashing of water. It was a rare kind of warmth, human warmth, echoing in a world otherwise ruled by silence and frost. A small but fascinating footnote tells of how even monasteries allowed bathing on certain feast days, though the monks approached it with humility. The abbot might bless the water before the first man entered, turning the act of washing into an expression of gratitude. The rising steam was described as the breath of prayer made visible. You kneel beside one of these ancient tubs now. The water glows gold in the candlelight, rippling gently. You dip your hand in and feel the softness of heat against your skin. It seeps into you slowly, loosening muscles, quieting thought. The warmth feels alive, as if the centuries have not cooled it. Outside the chamber, the wind claws at the stone, but here there is only stillness. You can almost imagine the sighs of those who once bathed in this same place, their voices echoing softly through time. The bath was more than luxury. It was rebellion. It said to winter, "You cannot have us entirely." As the last candle trembles and a thin trail of steam curls toward the ceiling, you realize why this place mattered so deeply. For one brief, fragrant hour, warmth was no longer survival. It was joy. And that joy, fleeting yet unforgettable, was enough to carry them through another endless season of cold. The scent of hay and fur greets you before the sound does. A soft rustle, a low snort, the shuffling of hooves against straw. You have entered the stables, that warm and living corner of the castle where breath clouds the air like gentle smoke. It is far warmer here than you expect. The animals, huddled together, give off waves of heat that ripple through the air. Their presence turns this cold stone space into something close to comfort. According to agricultural records from medieval estates, animals were not just workers or food sources, they were living radiators. The body heat of horses, cows, and pigs raised the temperature of barns and outbuildings by several degrees. In winter, people learned to build their living quarters close to or even above these animals. Heat rose through the floors, softening the bite of frost. The castle was not separate from its beasts, it breathed with them. A curious passage from a 14th century letter describes how servants would sometimes sleep in the stables on the coldest nights. Wrapped in cloaks, they lay near the horses, their faces pressed against the warm flanks of the animals. The writer notes that no fire on earth is gentler than the warmth of a living creature. For the poor, this companionship was both necessity and solace. One fact that most historians accept is that dogs played an important role in household warmth. Large hunting hounds and mastiffs were often allowed to sleep near their masters, sometimes even at their feet beneath the bedclothes. The phrase, "a three-dog night," used centuries later to describe bitter cold, has roots in this very practice. To share warmth with an animal was to acknowledge the fragility of both man and beast under the same winter sky. Some experts still debate how intentional this arrangement truly was. Did people design buildings for warmth through animals, or did the habit evolve naturally? Archaeological evidence from castles and manors suggests both. Some halls had adjoining stables, with only a wooden partition separating people and horses. The heat from the animals' bodies and the fermentation of hay created a steady, mild warmth that seeped through the walls. It was a humble but reliable source of comfort. A small but endearing detail from a Scottish account mentions that chickens and pigeons were sometimes kept in upper lofts near kitchens, their combined body heat helping to prevent frost from forming on the ceilings. Their constant movement added sound and life to the cold months, a soft fluttering that filled the silence. The warmth of feathers was warmth of spirit too. According to peasant folklore recorded centuries later, sleeping beside animals was believed to strengthen one's health. The steady rhythm of their breathing was thought to calm the heart and protect against night terrors. Some even said that the souls of animals carried warmth from the earth itself, lending it to those who shared their space. Whether you believe that or not, standing here, surrounded by quiet motion and warmth, you understand the comfort in such belief. An odd but amusing anecdote from an English manor recounts how a prized cow was once led into the great hall during a particularly harsh frost. The story says that the lady of the castle ordered it kept near the wall to share its warmth until the weather broke. Though it might sound absurd now, her decision was practical. The cow's breath alone could raise the temperature in a small room. There's ongoing discussion among environmental historians about the extent to which medieval people relied on animal heat deliberately. Some argue it was simply coincidence, others that it was a key part of architectural design in rural structures. The boundaries between shelter, stable, and storage were often fluid. Warmth did not care for dignity. It moved wherever life gathered. A lesser-known curiosity lies in the use of animal byproducts for heating. Dried dung, particularly from cattle, was a common fuel in regions where wood was scarce. It burned slowly, giving off steady heat and a distinctive, earthy smell. Though it might seem unthinkable now, this humble resource sustained entire villages through the cruelest winters. Even waste became warmth when nothing else could. According to an old Icelandic saga, farmers thanked their livestock during the first thaw of spring by letting them wander freely for a day. It was a gesture of gratitude, an acknowledgement that the animals' warmth had carried them through the season of death. The same sentiment echoed across Europe, in prayers and blessings whispered over barns as fires were lit. One detail recorded in monastic accounts describes the way monks in remote abbeys sometimes shared enclosed sleeping spaces with their sheep. The animals provided heat, while the monks offered protection. The arrangement blurred the line between humanity and nature. Warmth, in that moment, became a shared language. You walk deeper into the stable, your boots sinking softly into straw. The smell of hay and life fills your lungs. A horse turns its head toward you, its breath blooming in the air like a small, visible sigh. You reach out and touch its flank. The warmth there is astonishing, steady, and alive. You can feel the pulse beneath your palm, a heartbeat echoing the same rhythm as your own. Some scholars note that this mingling of human and animal life shaped the medieval understanding of comfort. To them, The castle was not a sterile fortress, but an ecosystem, a circle of shared existence. Each living creature gave something back to the other. The warmth of animals was not borrowed, it was exchanged. A small but poetic phrase appears in a Welsh poem from the 14th century. "The beasts are our winter fire." Those words linger in the mind, as if carrying an ancient truth. Fire gives heat through death, but animals give it through life. That difference meant everything in a world where death waited in every snowstorm. You linger a moment longer in the stable, listening to the slow rhythm of breathing, the shuffle of hooves, the rustle of straw. The walls glow faintly from a lantern hung nearby, the light catching on dust that floats like golden snow. It is warmer here than anywhere else you have been in the castle, not because of invention or wealth, but because life itself generates its own kind of fire. As you leave, you glance back at the animals, their shapes soft in the half-light. They seem content, unaware of the comfort they provide. You understand then that in the medieval world, warmth was not always something made. Sometimes it was something shared, passed quietly from one living being to another, without words or thanks, simply because the night was cold. The night outside is darker than ink, the sky heavy with clouds that hide even the stars. Inside the chapel, a faint glow trembles along the stone walls, the light of a few dozen candles trembling in brass holders. The air smells of beeswax, smoke, and something softer, something like hope. Here, warmth takes on another form. It is quieter, gentler, not only of the body but of the soul. According to surviving chronicles, faith was a vital source of comfort through medieval winters. Fire warmed the flesh, but prayer warmed the heart. In the darkest months, when the cold felt endless and the harvest lay buried under snow, the chapel became the castle's second hearth. Its candles, lit at dawn and dusk, were said to keep more than darkness away. They kept despair itself at bay. A small but vivid detail from a 15th century sermon describes how candlelight was compared to grace. Each tiny flame was a life, trembling but unextinguished. People saw in it the reflection of their own endurance. When the cold wind rattled the windows and the wax guttered, they whispered prayers not for spring, but for the strength to keep burning until it came. One fact most historians acknowledge is that candles were expensive and precious. Made from beeswax for the wealthy or tallow for everyone else, they burned quickly, filling the air with either sweetness or grease. In great castles, chapels and halls consumed hundreds through a single winter, yet their light was worth every coin. A single candle could lift the gloom of a room, and with it, the spirit of those inside. There is continued discussion among scholars about whether medieval faith increased or waned in the cold season. Some argue that hardship deepened devotion, turning prayer into necessity. Others suggest that ritual replaced warmth only because there was no other choice. But the evidence is clear. Even in the smallest villages, people gathered to sing, to light, to hope. The heat of those gatherings was real, even if the air stayed cold. A lesser-known curiosity recorded by a chronicler in Burgundy describes a ceremony known as the blessing of the hearth. Each year, at the start of winter, a priest would visit every home, sprinkle holy water on the fireplace, and bless the first flame of the season. It was both practical and sacred, a prayer that the fire would not fail. To them, warmth was divine protection made visible. According to the accounts of travellers, many chapels and churches served double purposes in winter. Their thick walls, built to hold silence, also held heat. On bitter nights, villagers would sleep near the altar, wrapped in blankets, their breath mingling with the incense. The presence of others, the sound of murmured prayer, and the soft light of candles created a sense of safety no hearth alone could provide. An odd but touching story from a northern monastery tells of monks melting snow in iron pots to make candles when supplies ran short. The wax was mixed with animal fat, rough and smoky, but it worked. "Light is light," the abbot wrote, "even when it smells of the barn." The phrase captured the humility of their world-imperfect warmth, imperfect light, and faith enough to sustain both. One well-documented truth from religious manuscripts is that light itself became a metaphor for warmth in medieval thought. The Latin word lux was used to mean both illumination and spiritual comfort. When a candle was lit during prayer, it symbolized the human soul resisting the cold of sin and death. To live without light was to live without warmth. A small but fascinating detail in household traditions tells of people leaving a candle burning through the longest night of winter, believing that its flame helped guide the sun back to the sky. Even those who could not afford faith in gold or grandeur believed in the power of a flicker. The idea of light returning gave them something to hold when the world froze around them. Some researchers still discuss how this spiritual connection to warmth influenced behavior. People shared fires more willingly, helped neighbors mend chimneys, or exchanged candles at festivals as gifts of friendship. The act of giving light became an act of love. Cold made generosity visible. According to letters written by monks and noble women alike, prayer itself often described warmth. "My heart burns for mercy," one abbess wrote during a harsh winter. "If God is fire, then we are his hearth." To them, warmth was not merely comfort but presence, the sense of being seen, held, and sustained by something greater. A curious practice found in rural communities involved lighting small fires outside chapel doors on Christmas Eve. Families stood together, sharing wine or spiced milk, faces lit by the glow. The warmth from the flames mingled with song, and for a single night, the world felt forgiving. They called these gatherings fires of joy, and their echo still lingers in winter festivals today. You kneel near the altar now, feeling the faint heat from the cluster of candles beside it. The wax drips slowly, pooling on the brass. Each flame bends and straightens again, defying the draft that seeps through the cracks. You realize that this glow, though fragile, is stronger than the cold that surrounds it. Outside, snow begins to fall again, fine and soft, catching the faint reflection of the chapel's light. The windows shimmer like the eyes of something patient. Inside, the silence grows deeper, more intimate. You breathe in the mingled scents of smoke, wax, and stone, and for the first time, you understand how faith itself could feel warm. Some scholars argue that these nightly rituals of light shaped the entire rhythm of medieval life. Morning began when the first candle was lit, night ended when the last was extinguished. Fire and time were one. The heartbeat of warmth was the heartbeat of prayer. You close your eyes and let the sound of the wind fade behind the walls. The glow of the candles seeps gently through your eyelids, filling you with a soft, golden calm. The chill still lingers in the air, but it no longer feels cruel. For now, the castle sleeps in the quiet warmth of devotion, its stone heart pulsing in time with every flickering flame. Morning light creeps across the frost-bitten battlements, pale and weak, barely touching the world below. You walk along the outer wall, the wind slicing across your face like the edge of a blade. The air here has no mercy, yet it feels strangely alive, filled with the sound of flags snapping and ravens calling. The guards stand wrapped in cloaks, their cheeks raw from cold. To them, this chill is not just hardship, it is part of their defense. According to military records and castle manuals from the late Middle Ages, cold was as much an ally as stone and steel. The bitter climate of winter made sieges difficult, froze rivers into barriers, and turned simple survival into a weapon. When the snow came, armies slowed, food rotted, and morale withered. A well-stocked, cold-proof castle could outlast an enemy simply by waiting. A curious entry in the chronicle of a northern fortress tells how defenders poured buckets of water over the walls during freezing weather, coating the stone in ice so smooth that no ladder or grappling hook could hold. The attackers slipped, the wind howled, and the castle remained untouched. The cold itself had become a shield, as formidable as any soldier. One fact most historians acknowledge is that winter warfare was dreaded by everyone involved. Soldiers' armor stiffened, weapons froze to their hands, and horses struggled to move through drifts. Yet those within the castle walls found ways to use the cold strategically. Moats froze solid, but could be broken and refrozen deliberately to trap invaders. Snow piled high against gates to reinforce them. Even the bitter air could become a deterrent when it carried sickness and fear. There is continued discussion among military scholars about whether commanders truly planned campaigns around temperature or simply endured it. Some claim that the best strategists used winter to their advantage, choosing when to fight or when to retreat based on frost and thaw. Others insist it was mostly luck and desperation. Either way, the cold shaped the pace of war as surely as the turning of the seasons. A lesser-known curiosity found in a Scandinavian saga describes warriors deliberately sleeping outside castle walls before dawn to acclimate themselves to the cold, so that when they stormed the gates, the chill would not slow them. They called it earning the frost. Their bodies became tools sharpened by suffering, living weapons tempered like iron in snow. According to accounts of castle life during sieges, defenders used the cold to preserve their supplies. Meat hung frozen in the kitchens for weeks, and water collected from snow. Fires burned low to conserve fuel, and people huddled together in the halls. While the attackers outside struggled to stay alive, those inside relied on discipline and patience. Warmth in these moments was not luxury but strategy. An odd but haunting record from a chronicler during a siege in Burgundy tells how soldiers tried to warm their hands by holding them over the corpses of horses, their last source of heat. The image is stark, yet it shows how deeply the cold ruled every part of life and death. Warmth was not only comfort, it was victory, and losing it meant surrender. One well-documented truth from castle design is that certain defensive features also serve to conserve heat. The same narrow corridors that made it difficult for enemies to pass through kept warm air trapped inside. Spiral staircases that turned clockwise forced right-handed attackers to fight awkwardly while climbing, but they also minimized drafts. In this way, warfare and survival intertwined in the very bones of the building. A small but fascinating detail from accounts of night watches describes guards rubbing oil on their hands and faces before standing post. The oil acted as a barrier against windburn, much like modern balms. Some even wore sheepskin under their armor for insulation. Their fires were forbidden on the walls for fear of giving away positions, so their only warmth came from movement and endurance. Some researchers still debate whether the concept of defensive cold extended beyond battle into symbolism. The chill of a castle, they argue, was not accidental. It represented strength, purity, and separation from the softer comforts of the world below. To live surrounded by cold was to show mastery over both nature and weakness. The noble ideal was not comfort, but control. According to letters from a knight stationed in Wales, the castle's cold was a kind of training. He wrote that the air sharpens the soul, as the whetstone sharpens the blade. He believed that comfort dulled courage, that every frost-bitten morning made him closer to the divine. It is easy to read arrogance in his words, yet there is also a strange honesty. In a world without choice, pride was warmth too. A curious note in a French chronicle tells how during harsh winters, defenders spread ashes on icy walkways to keep their footing. The same ashes came from the fires that warmed them the night before, turning heat's remains into protection. Nothing in a siege was wasted, not light, not flame, not even the memory of warmth. You stand beside a guard now, high on the parapet. His breath clouds the air, and his eyes squint against the glare of the snow. He does not complain. The cold is part of his uniform, a constant companion. You realize that for him, warmth is not comfort, but distraction. His task is to feel everything and endure it. Some scholars point out that castles were not only strongholds of defense, but symbols of endurance. They stood where the wind was harshest, where the cold bit hardest, as proof that civilization could survive the elements. To keep a fire burning inside such a fortress was not just survival, it was triumph. You look out across the frozen fields beyond the walls. The world is still, the snow gleaming faintly under the pale morning Sunday. The silence feels complete, yet beneath it lies a hum of tension, of strength contained. The cold holds everything in place. You step back into the corridor, the warmth of the inner walls brushing your face. Behind you, the guard remains at his post, motionless against the horizon. The cold is his ally now, a weapon no enemy can claim. Inside the castle, fires burn quietly, their light hidden from view, their heat reserved for those who endure within. Here, in this balance of frost and flame, the castle reveals its truest nature. It is not built to defy winter, but to use it. The cold keeps danger away, and the warmth, however faint, keeps the heart alive. You descend from the battlements, leaving the wind behind, and step into a long corridor lined with tapestries. The air grows warmer with each turn. Somewhere ahead, you hear laughter, the clinking of cups, and the faint melodic pluck of a lute. This is not the humble warmth of servants, or the rough comfort of guards. This is royal warmth, deliberate and designed, built for those who could command fire as easily as soldiers. According to detailed inventories from royal estates, kings and queens of the later Middle Ages enjoyed heating systems far more advanced than most of their subjects could imagine. Stone floors were lined with hidden chambers where fires burned unseen, and the hot air rose through small openings into the rooms above. This early form of underfloor heating, inspired by the ancient Roman hypocaust, made royal apartments surprisingly temperate even in midwinter. While peasants wrapped themselves in sheepskins, the monarchs of Europe walked barefoot on warm stone. A curious entry in the accounts of Windsor Castle notes the construction of such heating channels beneath the Queen's great chamber. It describes a furnace to warm her feet and ease the chill of the bones. The detail feels intimate, almost human, reminding you that even rulers with armies at their command were at the mercy of the cold. One fact nearly all historians agree upon is that these luxuries were rare and expensive to maintain. The systems required constant supervision, and the fires that fed them had to be tended day and night. Servants crawled through narrow tunnels beneath the floors, carrying coals and sweeping ashes, their backs bent in service to unseen comfort. For every noble who slept soundly, there were 10 unseen hands keeping the embers alive. There is continued discussion among architectural scholars about whether these heating systems were truly efficient or merely symbolic of status. Some argue that the warmth barely reached the rooms above, that the design was more gesture than success. Others claim that when built properly, the chambers could hold heat for hours, a marvel of early engineering. Either way, the message was clear. Warmth was power, visible proof of wealth and intelligence. A lesser-known curiosity from the French court records mentions how entire walls were sometimes hollowed to hold heated stones. These stones, warmed in furnaces, radiated heat through the plaster, creating gentle, even warmth without smoke. The technique was called stone breathing. Those who experienced it described it as heat without fire, a quiet luxury that impressed every visiting noble. According to the writings of a court physician, the royal bedchambers were kept between what he called the tempers of blood and air, not too hot to cause laziness, not too cold to invite illness. Candles burned steadily without guttering, a sure sign of balanced air. Servants adjusted vents and doors to maintain this fragile equilibrium. Comfort was treated almost as science, as if warmth itself obeyed rules of etiquette. An odd but telling story from the court of Burgundy describes how a visiting noble once fainted from the sudden heat of the royal chamber, unaccustomed to such luxury. The host reportedly laughed and said, "We are kings because we command even the seasons." It was boastful, perhaps, but not entirely false. In a world where cold defined survival, the ability to create steady warmth was the ultimate display of mastery. One well-documented truth from the inventories of French and English palaces is the abundance of materials used for insulation. Velvet drapes, thick carpets, and fur-lined chairs were not only symbols of wealth, but tools of temperature control. Every surface was chosen with the body in mind, built to absorb heat and reflect comfort. The royal warmth was as much art as architecture. A small but fascinating note from the household of King Charles V of France records the use of heated metal plates wrapped in cloth and slipped beneath the royal feet during audiences. These comfort plates were small, flat pieces of bronze or iron, replaced by servants whenever they cooled. The king's composure during long meetings was no accident. It was engineered. Some researchers still discuss whether such innovations ever truly separated the royals from the physical world around them. Letters from queens complain of nipping cold through the marble floor, while kings mention a creeping chill beneath the door despite all finery. Even surrounded by fire, wealth could not erase nature entirely. The cold always found a way in, humbling even the mightiest. According to a Venetian envoy who visited England in the 15th century, the royal apartments glowed like the hearth of God. He wrote that the air smelled of warm wax, wine, and spice, and that the rooms were lit so richly that winter itself seemed to vanish. His astonishment tells you how rare this comfort truly was. For most of the world, warmth was a flicker. Here, it was permanent daylight. A lesser-known anecdote from an English chronicler recalls how the servants would walk through the king's chambers barefoot to feel for cold spots. Wherever the stone felt icy, they placed new rugs or moved braziers closer. Even luxury demanded attention. Warmth was never simply enjoyed. It was managed, crafted, maintained. You move quietly through the royal hall now. The walls shimmer with tapestries, the floor soft beneath your feet, and the air carries a subtle sweetness of burning cedar. The room feels alive, not hot but balanced, the perfect kind of comfort that invites sleep but never dulls the mind. It is easy to imagine rulers thinking more clearly here, their thoughts unclouded by shivers or numb fingers. Some scholars suggest that this control over warmth shaped how royalty saw themselves. They did not just rule over people, they ruled over the elements. The fire obeyed them, the cold respected them, and comfort itself became a form of command. Yet beneath that mastery lay fragility. If the fires went out, if the servants failed, all the velvet and marble in the world could not hold the frost at bay. You stop before the hearth at the end of the chamber. The flames rise slow and steady, reflected in gold plates above. It is warmth built by human hands, not by chance or grace. Looking into it, you realize that royal comfort was not simply about luxury. It was proof that knowledge and labor could bend nature, if only for a little while. Outside the royal quarters, the air feels rougher, realer. The tapestries give way to bare walls, and the corridors narrow. You follow the sound of a door creaking open, then a gust of cold air slipping inside. This is not the world of silk and velvet. This is the world beyond the castle walls, where warmth means something simpler and more human. Here live the peasants, the blacksmiths, the farmers, the people who survive winter not through invention, but through persistence. According to parish records and travellers' accounts, the cottages clustered beneath the castle were built from wattle, daub and timber, their roofs thatched thickly with straw. The single room inside served as kitchen, bedroom and workshop all at once. At the centre, a fire burned in a shallow hearth set directly on the packed earth floor. Smoke rose through a hole in the roof, or simply drifted through the thatch, curling above sleeping children and chickens. It sounds crude, but this little fire was the soul of the home. A curious note from a Norman chronicler tells of walking through a village at dusk and seeing lines of blue smoke rising from every hut, winding into the sky like evening prayers. He wrote that the smell of peat and wood made the cold less cruel. The fire marked not wealth, but belonging. It said, "Someone lives here, someone endures." One fact most historians agree upon is that, despite their poverty, peasants often lived warmer than nobles. Their homes were smaller, their ceilings lower, their families larger. The closeness of bodies and the thick thatch overhead trapped heat more effectively than stone towers ever could. the cold still pressed at the walls, but inside, the warmth was personal, built from breath and labor rather than luxury. There is continued debate among social historians about whether peasant life in winter was unbearably harsh or surprisingly sustainable. Some argue that constant exposure toughened their bodies, making them almost indifferent to chill. Others suggest that hardship was constant and comfort fleeting. The truth, as always, lies between. They suffered, but they also adapted, finding grace in small fires and shared meals. A lesser-known curiosity recorded in a 12th century manor roll describes how families slept together in one large bed or on heaps of straw by the hearth. Children, parents, and even livestock often shared the same space, their combined warmth turning a humble cottage into a living furnace. To modern eyes it might seem crowded, but to them it was security. The sound of breathing in the dark meant life continued. According to the writings of a traveling priest, peasants treated their fires like altars. They fed them each morning with kindling, bowed slightly before them, and guarded them fiercely. If the fire died overnight, the household might borrow an ember from a neighbor, carrying it carefully in a clay pot through the snow. Sharing fire was not just kindness, it was community. An odd but heartwarming custom found in rural England tells of the winter ember. On the last night of autumn, villagers placed a special log in the hearth, marking the start of the cold season. Its embers would be preserved, tended carefully, until spring returned. If the ember survived the winter, it was said that the family would too. The symbolism was clear. Warmth was endurance made visible. One well-documented truth from peasant life is that smoke filled their homes so completely that their walls turned black within a few years. Yet that soot, unpleasant as it was, helped to seal cracks in the daub, making the house more weatherproof. The discomfort became protection, a strange partnership between pain and preservation. A small but fascinating note in medieval housekeeping guides mentions how herbs were hung from rafters above the hearth. Rosemary, sage, and thyme perfumed the air, disguising the smoke and serving as natural disinfectants. Their scent, mingled with the smell of burning peat, became the fragrance of winter survival. Some modern scholars suggest that the rhythm of peasant life created its own kind of warmth. The work of mending clothes, tending animals, baking bread, and storytelling around the fire kept bodies and minds moving. Idleness was the true cold. The hum of daily life, even in freezing months, generated energy that felt almost physical. According to local folklore collected centuries later, families sometimes buried hot stones from the hearth under their sleeping straw to warm it. Others placed clay pots filled with embers beneath blankets. The glow might fade by midnight, but its memory lingered long enough to help them drift into sleep. It was a poor man's luxury, yet deeply human in its simplicity. An odd detail from a traveller's diary in Flanders describes how peasants would rub snow on their faces before approaching the fire, believing that the sudden contrast kept their skin strong and their spirits awake. He found the habit barbaric, but perhaps it was their way of acknowledging the relationship between pain and life. You sit near one of these humble hearths now. The smoke stings your eyes, but the air is soft, alive with the crackle of wood and the faint bubbling of a pot. A child sleeps beside the fire, curled against a small dog. The mother hums while stirring stew, her movements slow and calm. The scene is modest, yet it holds more peace than all the velvet chambers above. Some researchers note that warmth in peasant homes was never wasted. Every bit of heat served multiple purposes: drying clothes, fermenting dough, softening wax, and warming food. The hearth was workshop, stove, and sanctuary all in one. Its flame bound the family together, both literally and emotionally. According to old village sayings, the cold outside is a lesson, the fire inside is the answer. You understand now what that meant. The peasants could not defeat the winter, but they could create meaning inside it. Warmth was not just heat, it was proof of belonging, of being part of something that kept going no matter how long the nights became. As you leave the cottage, the wind greets you sharply once more. The little plume of smoke above the roof bends and disappears into the grey sky. Behind the thin walls, life continues, steady and glowing. You look back one last time and realize that even the smallest hearth holds the same magic as a royal furnace. It does not matter how large the fire is, only that it burns. Snow drifts softly against the outer walls, piling in quiet heaps under the narrow windows. The cold outside is deep enough to still sound itself. Even the birds are silent. Inside the castle, the air changes. It hums with music and the murmur of laughter. The smell of spiced ale, roasted meat, and evergreen boughs fills the great hall. It is the heart of winter, and the people are celebrating. According to festival accounts kept by scribes and chroniclers, winter was not only endured but honoured. The harshest season brought with it the brightest fires. The Yule log, the great symbol of defiance against the long dark, was carried in with ceremony. It was chosen carefully from the oldest tree in the forest, blessed with wine, and placed upon the hearth where it was meant to burn through the 12 nights of Christmas. The act itself was an invocation, a way of saying that no matter how long the cold lasted, warmth and light would return. A curious note from a 15th century household journal describes how each member of the family touched the Yule log before it was lit, whispering a wish for the year ahead. The sparks that leapt from the fire were said to carry those wishes to heaven. People gathered close, eyes gleaming, their faces gilded by the orange glow. For a while, the walls themselves seemed to dance with the firelight. One fact that historians consistently acknowledge is that festivals were not only expressions of joy, but vital acts of survival. In times when daylight was scarce and food grew dull, celebration restored the spirit. The heat of crowded rooms, the rhythm of song, and the laughter shared over wine created an emotional warmth that carried people through the frozen months. Fire alone was not enough. It was community that kept the cold away. There is continued discussion among cultural scholars about whether winter festivals were religious or remnants of older pagan customs. Some argue that lighting the Yule log and decorating halls with evergreen were echoes of ancient rituals meant to honor the Sunday. Others believe that these customs blended naturally with Christian faith, transforming old nature worship into symbols of divine rebirth. Whatever their origin, the warmth of those nights was both sacred and human. A lesser-known curiosity from a Scottish account tells how villagers brought torches from the castle hearth to their homes after the feast, believing that carrying flame from a noble fire would bless their year. Children ran through the snow with smoking sticks held high, their laughter bright against the cold wind. Each ember that reached another hearth spread warmth across the land, one spark at a time. According to travellers' letters from that period, music played a central role in winter gatherings. Harps, flutes, and drums filled the great hall with sound, and dancing feet stirred the rushes on the floor. The movement itself became heat. People who had spent weeks shivering found freedom in motion, their breath rising like ghosts in the torchlight. The warmth of music was contagious. Even the oldest and weariest smiled. An odd but delightful note from a household steward in Normandy tells how spiced wine was heated over the embers and served to guests in wooden cups. Cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg were rare treasures, but during Yule they were poured freely. The fragrance filled the hall, mingling with pine branches and roasting meat. The feast became an orchestra of scent and sound, the very definition of living warmth. One well-documented truth from castle records is that the poorest villagers were sometimes invited to join in the celebration. On these nights, the boundaries between class and rank softened. Servants, farmers, and nobles sat under the same roof, their faces lit by the same fire. It was not generosity alone. It was understanding. Shared heat meant shared life. A small but fascinating detail from an English songbook mentions how special candles, called Christ lights, were burned beside the Yule log. Their wax was mixed with herbs, said to keep away illness and misfortune. The smoke rose sweet and thin, and when the flame finally died, families collected the remaining wax to save for spring planting. The idea that warmth could protect both body and field joined faith and nature in one gesture. Some researchers note that these festivals also served a practical purpose. The long fires kept vermin away, and the shared meals ensured that stores were rotated and renewed. Celebration and survival were twins, dressed in the same bright clothing. To feast was to prepare for endurance. According to an account from a cleric who attended such a feast, the noise and light were so powerful that the castle seemed to burn with happiness. He wrote that the walls glowed red and gold, that the snow outside looked pink from the reflection of the fire. The entire world for that one night appeared to be made of warmth. A curious tradition mentioned in a Welsh manuscript describes how the Yule log's ashes were kept all year to guard against lightning. Families believed that what had once defied the cold could also defy the storm. The ashes, grey and silent, carried the memory of flame. You stand now in the great hall, surrounded by song and laughter. A bard strums a slow tune while children chase each other near the hearth. The log crackles, sending a shower of sparks upward like golden snow. The air is thick with warmth and life, so full that it seems to hum against your skin. Some modern scholars believe that such winter gatherings shaped the idea of comfort itself. They were reminders that warmth was not only fire and fabric but connection. The presence of others magnified every degree of heat. To be alone was to be cold. To celebrate together was to become part of something glowing and infinite. You close your eyes for a moment, letting the noise fade into a soft murmur. The warmth seeps into you, steady and deep. It is easy to imagine that outside, the snow continues to fall, patient and endless. But inside, humanity holds its own kind of Sunday. As the song rises and the candles flicker, you realize that this, more than anything, is what medieval people meant by survival. Not simply enduring the cold, but answering it with joy. The fire burns brighter when shared, and every story, every song, every smile becomes part of its light. The feast fades slowly, leaving behind the lingering scent of wood smoke, pine, and spilled wine. The great hall falls quiet, save for the faint crackle of the fire still burning low in the hearth. You step outside into the courtyard. The air feels sharper now, the stars clearer, their light scattered like frost on black velvet. Your breath curls upward in a silver ribbon, and for a moment, the cold feels almost alive. According to castle accounts and travel diaries, winter nights were the hardest to bear. The fires in the halls burned down by midnight, and the walls that had once held warmth began to sigh it back into the night. The cold slipped through cracks, seeping under doors and through window frames, settling into the bones of the stone. People moved slower, spoke softer, as if not to disturb the darkness. A curious entry from a 14th century journal describes how guards on the night watch counted stars to stay awake. They gave them names, argued over patterns, and used the faint light of the heavens to measure the hours until dawn. The cold, though brutal, kept them alert. No warmth without wakefulness, one guard wrote, and no sleep without courage. One fact most historians agree upon is that medieval people did not expect comfort as we do. The night's cold was a companion, inevitable and familiar. They dressed for it, planned for it, and accepted it as part of life. Thick woolen cloaks, hoods, and mittens made from scraps of fur were passed from one generation to the next. In every household, there was at least one garment called the night piece, reserved for the coldest hours before dawn. There is continued debate among textile historians about how effective these layers truly were. Some believe the clothing only delayed the cold, while others note that wool's natural oils made it one of the few materials capable of staying warm even when damp. Either way, warmth was not about perfection but endurance. The goal was never to banish the cold completely, only to live alongside it. A lesser-known curiosity from English folklore tells that people whispered small charms to keep warm. A traveller might murmur, "Fire at my feet, friend at my side," before setting out into the night. Words, they believed, could summon courage and comfort. Whether magic or habit, the act reminded them that warmth began in the mind as much as in the body. According to letters from servants, the castle's outer walls often grew so cold that frost formed indoors. In some places, the stones glimmered faintly under torchlight, and the rushes on the floor stiffened with ice. Servants learned to move quietly, their footsteps soft to avoid waking others. At night, the castle became a frozen cathedral of whispers. An odd but telling record from a northern estate describes how cats were allowed to roam freely through the halls during winter. They hunted mice, but they also slept on beds, laps, and window ledges, their bodies small sources of steady warmth. One steward called them the moving embers of the house. One well-documented practice in wealthier homes was the use of bed warmers, metal pans filled with coals, slid between the sheets before sleeping. The pans were moved carefully to avoid scorching the linens. The smell of warm metal and faint ash filled the air, mingling with the scents of wool and candle wax. For a few moments, the bed felt like summer. A small but fascinating note in a servant's handbook explains that these warmers were also used on garments. Cloaks, gloves, and even boots were briefly laid near the fire before being worn. The act was practical, but also ceremonial. To put on warmth before stepping into the cold felt like donning invisible armor. Some researchers have observed that the medieval rhythm of rest and wakefulness was shaped by the cold. People often slept in two phases, the first sleep and the second. They would wake in the middle of the night, tend the fire, pray, talk softly, or eat before returning to bed. The gap between these sleeps became a small, private time of thought, a bridge between darkness and dawn. According to the writings of a monk who chronicled winter life, this broken sleep was not a hardship but a comfort. In the quiet between sleeps, he wrote, the world seems slower and God's voice louder. It was a moment of reflection, of warmth born not from fire but from calm. An odd but charming superstition recorded in rural France claimed that those who rose during the night should always greet their fire, saying softly, "You kept me, I thank you." Forgetting this courtesy, it was said, invited misfortune or cold dreams. The hearth was treated as both servant and spirit, something alive enough to deserve gratitude. You stand again near the castle's central hearth, the one that never truly dies. The logs have turned to embers, glowing deep orange, their light pulsing gently in the dark. The air smells of oak and soot. Each pop of the fire sounds like a heartbeat. Around it, the world feels suspended between night and morning. Some scholars suggest that the cold of these hours gave rise to a deeper appreciation of warmth. To wake and see the fire still glowing was reassurance that life continued. It was the simplest of victories, yet one that defined the entire rhythm of winter. The people who lived in these castles, for all their hardship, knew how to treasure that small triumph. You crouch beside the fire and hold out your hands. The heat licks gently at your skin, and the cold behind you fades. In this balance between flame and frost, you understand something the medieval world knew well. Warmth is not abundance. It is a flicker, a fragile thing that exists because someone, somewhere, stayed awake to tend it. Outside, the wind sighs against the walls. Inside, the fire burns quietly on. The castle sleeps, but its heart still glows. The night may belong to the cold, but morning always belongs to the flame. The next morning arrives softly, a faint pink light stretching over the snow. You wake to the smell of bread baking somewhere deep in the castle. The air is still cold, but not bitter. The fire from the night before has been rekindled, and smoke rises lazily through the chimney. The castle stirs back to life, every sound carrying the rhythm of another day's survival. According to detailed household records, mornings in medieval winters began with ritual precision. Before dawn, servants lit fires in the kitchens and halls, using embers saved overnight. Those glowing coals were precious. Losing them meant starting from nothing, a task that could take hours. Fire was a chain that had to remain unbroken. One flame passed to another, day after day, linking generations by the steady breath of smoke. A curious account written by a castle steward describes how families used to keep a hearth pot covered with ash to preserve embers through the night. The ash acted like a blanket, smothering the fire without extinguishing it. At dawn, the pot was stirred, and the faint orange glow within sprang back to life. The first burst of heat in the morning felt like resurrection. One fact historians consistently agree on is that medieval mornings were cold enough to test resolve. Water left in basins froze solid. The air stung lungs with every breath. People dressed quickly, pulling on garments still warm from the bed or from stones heated by the fire. Even the act of washing required courage. Those who dared splash their faces with icy water described it as a shock sent by God to remind us we still live. There is continued debate among cultural historians about whether the daily rekindling of the fire held symbolic meaning or was simply practical. Some claim it was treated almost as prayer, a renewal of life at sunrise. Others believe it was routine, a chore among many. Yet the language of the records suggests reverence. The fire was never started, it was awakened. A lesser-known curiosity appears in an Old English poem that praises the keeper of the morning flame. This title, likely belonging to a servant or spouse, honored the one who rose first to light the day. In many households, this person's task carried both domestic and spiritual weight. To rekindle the hearth was to invite warmth, light, and hope back into the home. According to surviving instructions from castle kitchens, fires were lit differently depending on their purpose. Cooking fires were built high and hot, warming fires low and steady. The arrangement of logs and kindling was an art, taught by experience. The right fire could last half a day with minimal fuel, while the wrong one smoked the hall black and wasted precious wood. An odd but charming note from a household manual mentions the morning hush, the brief moment after the fire caught but before anyone spoke. It was a superstition that silence helped the flame grow stronger. If someone spoke too soon, it was said the day would be unlucky. For a few seconds each morning, entire rooms glowed in peace and quiet, the only sound the crackle of new life. One well-documented practice in cold regions was the use of heated stones or bricks wrapped in cloth to warm the hands before beginning work. These stones were placed near the fire during breakfast and carried throughout the day. The warmth they held was small but intimate, a personal secret against the chill. Even nobles carried them discreetly under gloves or sleeves. A small but fascinating entry in a monk's journal describes how winter mornings changed the rhythm of prayer. He wrote that the brothers' breath made fog before the altar, and that their voices sounded heavier, slower, shaped by the cold air. Yet he found beauty in it, saying the frost made every word shine as clearly as crystal. In that stillness, warmth came through voice instead of flame. Some researchers note that breakfast itself often revolved around heat. Porridge, broth, and warm ale were staples. Food did not simply nourish, it restored warmth to the core of the body. To eat cold fare in winter was seen as unwise, even disrespectful to the season. Meals were slow, filled with steam and comfort. According to letters from travellers, the first hours of daylight were the most treacherous. The world looked peaceful under its blanket of snow, yet paths were slick, rivers frozen, and air brittle enough to crack lips and skin. People walked carefully, their footsteps crunching rhythmically, leaving trails that vanished by afternoon. Every journey required timing and faith. An odd but thoughtful practice recorded in several villages involved children greeting the rising sun by holding their hands to it, as though warming themselves from afar. Parents encouraged this habit, calling it catching the day. It was a simple gesture, but one that bound them to the promise of light returning. You move toward the courtyard now. Servants shovel snow away from doorways, their laughter rising through the cold air. Smoke curls upward from every chimney, each one marking a victory against winter's reach. The castle feels alive again, breathing in rhythm with the dawn. Some modern historians believe that this daily renewal of warmth defined medieval resilience more than any invention. Every sunrise demanded faith, that the embers would catch, that the fire would hold, that the day would be kind. It was a ritual of repetition and hope, written into the rhythm of every household from lord to peasant. You stop beside a small fire burning near the gatehouse. The flames are young, bright and restless. A guard holds his hands above them, rubbing warmth into his fingers. He smiles faintly, as if the fire itself were greeting him. You realize that in this simple act lies the essence of survival. Every morning in the medieval world began with the same quiet miracle, the rebirth of warmth. No matter how long the night, no matter how cruel the frost, someone always woke before dawn to feed the flame. And because of that, the world kept going. The day brightens slowly, and the castle hums with quiet work. The cold never leaves entirely, but it settles into the background now, a presence tolerated rather than feared. You walk through the courtyard and see a figure near the smithy, the glow of orange fire pulsing against the grey morning. The air here feels alive again, full of motion and breath. The forge is roaring. According to guild records and workshop accounts, the blacksmith's forge was one of the warmest and most constant fires in any medieval community. It burned long before dawn and long after dusk, fed by coal or charcoal, bellows pumping like lungs. Its heat could soften iron, harden tools, and warm every soul within its reach. For many castles and villages, the forge was both workplace and refuge, a steady heart of warmth that never slept. A curious description in a 14th century traveller's letter calls the forge a sun trapped in a cave. He wrote of stepping inside from the snow and feeling his skin sting with sudden heat, his breath evaporating instantly. Sparks leapt like stars across the dark room, and the sound of the hammer was as rhythmic as a heartbeat. The blacksmith, bare-armed and calm, seemed to stand within a living fire. One detail most historians agree upon is that blacksmiths occupied a special place in medieval life. They were craftsmen, and magicians both feared and respected. They understood fire better than anyone. They knew how to tame it, how to feed it, how to make it serve purpose without destruction. In a world where warmth meant survival, the blacksmith's skill was sacred knowledge. There is continued discussion among cultural historians about how much superstition surrounded these figures. Some argue that blacksmiths were seen as nearly supernatural, protected by the very fire they mastered. Others see them simply as practical men with tough hands and clever minds. Yet every story, from village myth to royal record, describes them as keepers of power. The forge was their chapel, and the flame their god. A lesser-known curiosity found in Norse accounts tells how smiths blessed their forges with salt or wine before the first strike of the hammer each year. The gesture was both superstition and gratitude, a promise that the fire would be fed with respect as well as fuel. The air would fill with the scent of burning salt and metal, a sharp perfume that marked the beginning of work and warmth alike. According to castle inventories, the blacksmith's forge was often located near stables or gates, where its heat could be shared by guards and animals. In winter, soldiers would gather there to warm their hands while waiting for their armor to be repaired. Horses stamped and snorted nearby, comforted by the radiating heat. The forge became a crossroads of warmth, where duty and necessity met in glowing light. An odd but touching note from a castle steward describes how children would sneak to the smithy on cold nights to warm their feet by the coals. The blacksmith, pretending not to notice, would hammer louder so the lord upstairs wouldn't hear their giggles. He made warmth for all, the steward wrote, even for those who had no right to it. One well-documented truth from metallurgical records is that the forge's fire required constant attention. It could not be left alone for even a short while. The blacksmith worked in rhythm with the bellows, every movement precise and necessary. The glow of the coals told him everything he needed to know. If they burned too bright, the metal would spoil; too dim, and the work would fail. He read heat as others read words. A small but fascinating discovery in an archaeological dig revealed traces of clay pipes beneath an old forge floor. These pipes directed air toward the fire, creating higher temperatures. The design predated industrial furnaces by centuries. It shows that the blacksmiths of the medieval world were engineers in all but name, blending instinct with innovation. Some researchers note that the forge was also a social space. Men gathered there to talk, to trade gossip, to share ale while the fire roared. The blacksmith's warmth drew people the way modern towns gather around cafes or pubs. The flame was not only utility but community. Even silence felt friendly beside it. According to songs and ballads, blacksmiths often worked while humming or chanting softly. The rhythm of their hammer matched the beat of their breath. In those songs, the forge became an instrument. The clang of iron was music, the hiss of steam the harmony. The result was warmth not only of fire, but of spirit, a reminder that even labor could be beautiful. An odd but enduring superstition claimed that a forge fire should never go dark completely. Even if no work was planned, the blacksmith kept a single coal glowing in the heart of the ash. It was said that extinguishing it entirely invited misfortune. The coal symbolized continuity, the same light carried from year to year, proof that human hands could preserve the world's spark. You move closer to the forge now. The heat reaches you in slow waves, filling your chest and face. The blacksmith glances up, nods once, and keeps working. Sparks fly around him, tiny constellations that vanish before touching the ground. The hammer strikes again and again, the sound deep and sure. You realize that this rhythm, this glowing labor, is the castle's second heartbeat. Some modern historians believe that the forge embodied the perfect union of fire and purpose. Unlike the hearth, which comforted, or the brazier, which soothed, the forge transformed. It turned cold, dead metal into tools and weapons, shaping civilization itself. In mastering warmth, the blacksmith gave it meaning. You watch the final spark fall into the ashes and fade. The blacksmith leans back, wiping his forehead. The forge still hums, alive and pulsing with red light. The cold outside waits patiently beyond the door, but it cannot cross this threshold. Within these walls, fire has become something more than survival. It has become creation. The forge cools behind you as you walk back into the castle, following the faint echo of footsteps up a winding stair. The air changes once more. You emerge into the library, a long chamber filled with the scent of parchment, ink, and dust, warmed gently by a nearby brazier. The light here is soft and golden, filtering through narrow windows onto rows of manuscripts. You can feel the hush, the careful stillness of a place where thought itself was kept warm. According to monastic and royal household records, libraries and scriptoria were often given special attention during the cold months. The fragility of parchment, ink, and bindings made warmth not a comfort but a necessity. Without steady temperature, the pages stiffened and cracked, and the ink flaked away. The scholars who tended them worked beside small fires, bundled in layers, their fingers stained black from writing and soot. A curious detail from a 15th century scholar's letter describes the little stove of wisdom, a nickname given to the brazier kept near his writing desk. He wrote that the fire's glow felt like companionship, that it spoke with crackles as the ink spoke with words. The phrase captures perfectly how heat and thought were intertwined. Warmth allowed the mind to move. One fact most historians agree upon is that knowledge was a delicate thing in winter. Candles guttered in drafts, making reading difficult, and ink thickened in the cold, forcing writers to warm their pens by the flame. Margins of surviving manuscripts show faint burn marks, proof of how close scribes worked to their fires. A single spark could destroy a book, but without fire, the words could not be written at all. There is continued debate among historians of science about how the environment shaped learning. Some argue that the constant chill sharpened focus and discipline. Others suggest it limited creativity, forcing thought into slow, measured rhythms. Yet the evidence of illuminated manuscripts, those vibrant colours and intricate flourishes, proves that even in the coldest rooms, beauty thrived. A lesser-known curiosity found in a monk's winter journal tells how the brothers in the scriptorium rotated their seats around the hearth every few hours. The closest position to the fire was a privilege, earned through diligence or luck. They joked that the best scholars were those who could endure the furthest corner. The humour feels timeless, echoing the quiet competition of comfort that still defines shared workspaces today. According to accounts from the libraries of Paris and Prague, manuscripts were sometimes warmed gently before being read. The parchment, made from animal skin, responded to heat, growing supple and easy to handle. Servants would wave the pages above small coals, or lay them briefly near a heated stone. It was a careful dance between preservation and destruction. Too close, and centuries of thought could vanish in smoke. An odd but charming practice recorded in the writings of an Italian scribe involved warming ink by placing the bottle inside a hollowed loaf of bread. The dough insulated it, keeping the liquid from freezing while also spreading a faint aroma of wheat through the room. "It smells of both hunger and learning," he wrote, "a fair mixture for winter." One well-documented truth from royal accounts is that books were often stored in upper chambers where sunlight could warm the walls for part of the day. Windows were kept small to preserve heat, and shutters closed the moment the light faded. Each book represented years of labor and the warmth of countless hands. To protect them was to protect humanity's own fragile fire of understanding. A small but fascinating discovery made during the restoration of an English abbey revealed faint smoke stains on the ceilings of its library. The soot patterns aligned perfectly with where old braziers once stood. It seems the air of wisdom was always mixed with the breath of fire. The scholars who wrote beneath that haze likely carried the scent of smoke wherever they went. Some researchers believe that the cold itself may have influenced the rhythm of medieval storytelling. Long winters encouraged introspection and conversation by the hearth. Tales were told to fill the darkness, to pass time while snow buried the roads outside. The very cadence of epic poetry, slow and steady, may have been born from nights when words replaced warmth. According to later writings, nobles often kept small collections of books in their chambers during winter to read beside the fire. The rustle of parchment, the soft hiss of logs, and the faint smell of leather created an atmosphere of deep peace. The pursuit of knowledge became both a mental and physical refuge, a kind of fire of the mind. An odd, but poignant letter from a scholar in the early 15th century confesses, "My fingers grow stiff, yet I write, for the flame inside my chest is hotter than the one beside my chair." His words reveal the truth of that age. Intellect itself was a form of heat, and thought, once kindled, could outlast even the longest winter. You sit now at a heavy oak table, the air thick with quiet warmth. The fire pops occasionally, punctuating the silence like a heartbeat. You open a manuscript and trace the inked letters, the surface faintly rough beneath your fingertips. Each line feels alive, born from human endurance. Every word you touch carries the memory of someone who once leaned close to a fragile flame to write it. Some modern scholars describe medieval learning as a discipline of warmth. They mean that knowledge required effort, proximity, and care, the same traits needed to tend a fire. The light of understanding did not blaze easily. It had to be coaxed, guarded, and shared. You close the manuscript and sit back, listening to the soft hum of the brazier. The heat against your skin feels identical to the warmth of thought itself, quiet, steady, alive. You realize that every flame, from the hearth to the forge to the scholar's candle, served the same purpose: to push back the cold of ignorance and despair. Outside, the wind rattles faintly at the shutters, but inside, the library glows. The firelight trembles across the pages, and the air hums with the warmth of both body and mind. Here, in this sanctuary of ink and ash, the castle's oldest truth continues. Light and heat are the same language, and knowledge burns as brightly as flame. Evening returns quietly, like a familiar visitor slipping through the corridors. The torches flicker to life one by one, their flames reflected in the polished metal of helmets and cups. The castle exhales as though tired from holding its breath all day. Outside, the world fades into white and shadow, but inside, warmth begins its nightly ritual again. According to household records, evenings in a medieval castle were carefully orchestrated moments of restoration. After the day's work ended, fires were stoked anew, doors were barred, and servants spread fresh rushes on the floors to muffle draughts. The entire building seemed to prepare itself for the long hours of dark. Warmth became the focus of every action. A curious note from a chamberlain's logbook lists his nightly duties. Check each brazier, close every shutter, and ensure that no candle burned unattended. The final line reads, "Let all flame be watched, for in its heart is our peace." The phrasing sounds almost like prayer. In those hours, tending fire was more than a task. It was a kind of devotion. One fact most historians acknowledge is that fire maintenance shaped medieval schedules. People measured time by the life of the flame. When it was high, meals began. When it dimmed, rest followed. The rhythm of heat guided the rhythm of living. There were no clocks to command them, only the steady pulse of burning wood and the whispers of embers turning to ash. There is continued discussion among cultural historians about how communal life changed after sunset. Some believe the darkness encouraged intimacy songs, storytelling, shared warmth. Others argue that fear of cold and night made people retreat into silence. Letters and records suggest both are true. Some nights glowed with laughter, others with nothing but the soft sound of crackling wood. A lesser-known curiosity appears in the accounts of travelling musicians who visited noble courts. They often performed beside the hearth, their instruments tuned by heat. Lutes and viols warped if left too near the flames, but sounded lifeless if kept too far. The perfect distance was learned by instinct. The warmth that made their hands supple also kept their music alive. According to contemporary descriptions, storytelling was the most common form of evening entertainment. Around the fire, people told tales of knights and saints, of miracles and monsters. The stories shifted with the crackle of the wood, sometimes growing bold, sometimes quiet. The listeners leaned closer, not only for the plot, but for the comfort of shared nearness. The heat bound the listeners together as surely as the tale. An odd but lovely custom from an English manor involved sprinkling herbs into the fire before the stories began. Rosemary for remembrance, lavender for calm, sage for protection. The scent filled the air, mingling with smoke until the entire hall seemed scented with memory. The fire became a participant, exhaling comfort into the night. One well-documented truth from winter records is that animals gathered close to fires too. Dogs stretched by the hearths, cats dozed on benches, and falcons roosted in warm corners near their masters. The hall became a living circle of warmth, every creature included. The boundary between humanity and nature blurred under the same flame. A small but fascinating entry from a Welsh castle's account book mentions how the ashes from the day's fires were sifted carefully before sleep. Large coals were saved and buried in ash to be rekindled at dawn. The rest were spread thin to prevent accidental flare-ups. The night was a delicate balance between protection and preservation. Some scholars point out that this nightly care reflected the medieval sense of responsibility. To them, warmth was never passive. It had to be earned, maintained, and respected. A single careless ember could erase everything built by years of labor. In this vigilance lay both comfort and anxiety. According to the journals of household servants, the evenings were also times of quiet companionship. Workers gathered in the kitchens after duties were done, sipping broth and mending clothes by the fire. They laughed softly, shared scraps of bread, and told their own stories of love, of superstition, of small victories against the cold. For them, the warmth was not elegance, it was equality. An odd but tender description from a priest's letter speaks of hearing the castle's fires at night. He wrote, "Each flame speaks its own tongue. Together they murmur a hymn to survival. Perhaps he meant the subtle symphony of sound that fills a quiet hall, the pop, hiss, and sigh of wood surrendering to light. Those noises formed a kind of music, the heartbeat of winter nights. One well-known observation by social historians is that warmth after dusk carried emotional weight. The shared fire created trust. People confided their secrets, made promises, fell in love beside the glow. Heat softened caution. It made humanity visible again after the day's hard labor and isolation. A lesser-known superstition whispered across Europe held that extinguishing all flames before midnight brought bad luck. Even in castles, one ember was always left alive, watched over by a servant or a cat. Its glow symbolized continuity, a small sun held captive until morning returned. You sit now beside the largest hearth in the great hall. The logs collapse inward, releasing a shower of sparks that rise like tiny souls. The firelight paints the faces of those around you in warm gold. Someone hums a soft tune, and a few others join in. The room feels lighter, its shadows gentler. Some modern historians describe this moment, the quiet end of a medieval day, as the purest expression of warmth. It was not grand or technological. It was the result of attention, patience, and the understanding that life depended on care. Each night repeated the same fragile triumph. The cold waited, and the people kept it at bay. You lean closer to the fire, listening to its low rhythm. The wood sighs as if in contentment, and a thin column of smoke drifts lazily upward toward the dark rafters. Outside, the snow keeps falling. Inside, everything glows. Warmth, you realize, was never a single invention or luxury. It was an act, a daily deliberate choice to keep the world bright for one more night. Morning comes again, pale and thin, the kind of light that feels fragile enough to break. The castle stirs once more, but today feels different. The fires burn a little lower, the voices softer, the rhythm slower. Winter is still strong outside, yet inside, the rooms feel steady, calm, almost timeless. You wander through the corridors one last time, tracing the long story of how this fortress has learned to breathe warmth from stone and effort. According to accounts kept by builders and stewards, the castle's design itself became a map of warmth. The kitchens near the hearth, the bedchambers above them, the chapels tucked against south-facing walls, all arranged with quiet intelligence. Heat was not wasted. It was invited to stay, coaxed and guided like a shy guest. The architecture of survival was as deliberate as any act of war or worship. A curious note from a 13th century mason describes his pride in building a wall that drinks the Sunday. He had angled the outer stone to catch daylight for a few precious hours each morning, letting it linger on the interior face long after sunset. The idea seems poetic, yet it worked. Even in winter, the room warmed slightly faster. Sometimes, invention was born from nothing more than patience and observation. One fact historians often point out is that medieval comfort was never effortless. Every ember, every blanket, every layer of clothing required labor. Fires had to be fed, curtains mended, rushes replaced, walls checked for cracks. Warmth depended not only on wealth but on constant attention. Those who lived in castles understood that luxury was fragile. Without care, even the grandest hearth could fall cold overnight. There is continued discussion among modern scholars about how this constant struggle with temperature shaped the medieval mindset. Some believe it instilled humility, a sense of respect for nature's power. Others argue that it created a kind of stoic optimism, a belief that perseverance itself was noble. Whatever the cause, it gave rise to a culture where comfort was treasured because it was temporary. A lesser-known curiosity recorded by travelers from southern lands tells of their astonishment at how northerners could find peace inside such cold stone halls. They expected misery, yet found laughter. They warm each other with stories. One Italian merchant wrote, "And in their laughter, I swear I feel heat." According to household chronicles, warmth was always communal. Families gathered around the same hearth. Workers shared their breath in crowded kitchens. And even the lonely watchman on the walls found companionship in the small glow of a brazier. Heat was not measured in degrees, but in presence. The more bodies gathered, the stronger the fire seemed to burn. An odd but moving detail from a servant's letter describes how, after years of service, he began to think of warmth as a kind of voice. "It speaks," he wrote, softly, as if asking us to stay alive. Perhaps he was right. Each crackle of the fire, each sigh of the wind against the shutters, became part of a conversation between human endurance and the world's indifference. One well-documented truth from the chronicles of households both great and small is that warmth was inseparable from memory. The fire was the backdrop of every birth, death, and meal. Generations passed before it, their stories layered in its smoke. When someone died, ashes from the hearth were sometimes scattered over the grave, symbolizing that life and flame were one and the same. A small but fascinating observation made by an archaeologist studying soot deposits in castle chimneys reveals something poetic. The higher the soot, the steadier the lives inside. Consistent fires meant consistent habitation, year after year. In that residue of smoke lay the fingerprint of persistence. Some scholars suggest that warmth, in the medieval sense, was not only physical, but moral. To keep the fire alive was to uphold duty toward family, toward faith, toward the fragile structure of life itself. A dying hearth was not simply an inconvenience. It was a warning. Warmth demanded kindness, cooperation, and vigilance. According to one early manuscript, a lord once said to his steward, "Guard the flame as you guard my treasure." The words were not metaphorical. The treasure of fire was real, immediate, and shared. Without it, no fortress, however mighty, could last a single night. You stop before the great hearth of the hall, the same one that began this long journey. The flames leap and sway, painting the stone walls gold. Around you, the castle hums with quiet motion, servants carrying wood, dogs curled by the door, a cook's laughter drifting from somewhere unseen. It feels alive, every movement a small act of defiance against the cold pressing outside. Some modern historians argue that warmth, as the medieval world understood it, was a form of faith. It asked for patience and rewarded care. The people who lived in these walls did not expect comfort to come freely. They created it, kindled it, rebuilt it daily from ash. Their fires were as mortal as they were, and in tending them they learned devotion. You watch the flames for a long while. The sound of crackling wood fills the silence like gentle applause. The smoke curls upward, carrying the scent of oak, pine, and the faint sweetness of old air. The room glows softly, a cocoon of light against the endless winter beyond the walls. You realize that every flicker of that fire is a continuation of the same story, the story of human warmth refusing to vanish. And as the castle settles once more into its steady breathing, you understand that warmth was never just heat. It was a promise. A promise made every morning when the fire was lit, every night when the coals were covered, and every time someone reached out their hands to share it. The castle grows still. Outside, snow drifts soundlessly across the courtyard, layering the earth in white. The air feels soft now. The violence of the wind faded into a hush. The last flames in the hearth pulse gently, a slow heartbeat against the dark. You breathe in the warmth that remains, faint but faithful, and let your thoughts grow heavy and slow. The stories you have followed through these walls, the servants and their embers, the nobles and their grand chambers, the monks, the peasants, the blacksmiths, all begin to blend together. Each of them, in their own way, built a life from the same fragile element. Fire was not only their comfort but their language, a quiet conversation between body and soul. You can almost hear them still, the faint clink of tools, the murmur of prayer, the whisper of fabric drawn across a window. They move in rhythm with the flames, careful, deliberate, alive. Their warmth was temporary, but their effort eternal. Every breath they took fed the same invisible glow that still lives here, long after their footsteps faded. The last sparks fall, glowing faintly like dying stars. The stones remember them. The air still carries the scent of heat. And as you close your eyes, you realize that the warmth of those ancient fires has traveled farther than anyone could have guessed. It burns now in your imagination, soft and endless. The castle sleeps at last. The cold presses close, patient but powerless. Somewhere deep inside, beneath stone and ash, the last ember curls quietly, waiting for another dawn. You breathe with it, slowly, letting the night settle around you like a blanket. Good night. Sleep warm.